Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the workshops, marketplaces, and royal courts of medieval Europe, a world of candlelight and cathedral bells, where innovation moved slowly, but never truly stopped. Some inventions were celebrated as breakthroughs, others were dismissed as failures, and yet, centuries later, we're still living with the legacy of both. If you enjoy long, thoughtful explorations of history like this, consider subscribing. Many regular listeners do, simply so they don't miss the next deep dive into the quieter, often overlooked corners of the past. It helps this channel continue producing calm, in-depth historical documentaries for curious minds like yours. Now let's begin. When we think of the Middle Ages, roughly spanning the 5th to the late 15th century in Europe, we often imagine a static world. Stone castles, iron swords, monks copying manuscripts by candlelight. Compared to the Renaissance or the Industrial Revolution, medieval Europe can seem technologically conservative, even resistant to change. But that perception is misleading. Medieval society was filled with experimentation. Artisans constantly tested new tools. Rulers funded ambitious building projects. Scholars debated mechanical theories inherited from Rome and the Islamic world. Merchants searched for better ways to store goods, preserve food, and secure wealth. Not every innovation succeeded. In fact, many failed commercially, politically, or practically. Yet failure in history is rarely permanent. Sometimes an idea appears too early. Sometimes it lacks the supporting infrastructure. Sometimes society simply isn't ready. And sometimes, centuries later, the same idea quietly returns and reshapes the world. One of the clearest examples lies in medieval banking. In the early Middle Ages, large-scale banking systems had largely collapsed with the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Coinage remained in use, but long-distance financial networks weakened. By the 12th and 13th centuries, however, trade was expanding again across Europe. Italian city-states like Florence, Venice, and Genoa became commercial powerhouses. To facilitate trade without physically moving heavy, vulnerable shipments of coin, merchants began experimenting with written financial instruments, letters of credit, and early forms of bills of exchange. In theory, these allowed a merchant in Florence to deposit funds locally and withdraw them in another city without transporting gold. It was safer, more efficient, and adaptable to expanding trade networks. But there was a problem. The medieval church officially prohibited usury, charging interest on loans. While complex legal workarounds developed, financial systems remained morally controversial and politically fragile. Banking houses frequently collapsed. The powerful Bardi and Peruzzi families of Florence, for example, failed spectacularly in the 14th century after extending enormous loans to European monarchs who could not repay them. To many contemporaries, large-scale banking looked unstable, even dangerous. Financial collapse could ripple across entire cities. Trust was everything, and trust was easily broken. Yet the basic mechanism of credit, deposits, and transferable value survived. What seemed like repeated failure in the medieval period laid the foundation for the modern banking system. Today's global financial networks, digital transfers, credit instruments, international trade finance, owe a direct lineage to those early experiments in Florence and Venice. The medieval version struggled, collapsed more than once, but we still use its core principles every day. Another example appears in the realm of mechanical timekeeping. For most of medieval Europe, time was measured by the sun, church bells, and water clocks inherited from antiquity. Monastic communities, in particular, needed structured schedules for prayer. This demand drove experimentation. By the 13th and 14th centuries, mechanical clocks began appearing in European towns. These early clocks were large, heavy, and astonishingly inaccurate. They required constant adjustment and often drifted significantly over days or weeks. They were expensive civic symbols as much as practical tools. Town councils installed them in towers to demonstrate wealth and order. But for daily life, they were often unreliable. To many ordinary people, the mechanical clock must have seemed impressive yet impractical. Sundials were simpler. Church bells worked well enough. In a sense, the early mechanical clock failed as a precise instrument. Yet the concept of mechanically regulated time endured. Incremental improvements, pendulums, springs, refined gearing, transformed the technology over centuries. By the early modern period, accurate portable watches emerged. By the Industrial Revolution, precise timekeeping became essential to railways, factories, and global coordination. Today, synchronized time governs nearly every aspect of modern life, from financial markets to air travel to digital communication. Those clumsy medieval clock towers, drifting minutes off course, were the imperfect ancestors of atomic clocks and GPS timing systems. The failure was temporary. The legacy was permanent. Medieval urban planning offers another striking case. As European towns expanded during the High Middle Ages, many grew organically without centralized design. Streets were narrow. Sanitation was limited. Waste disposal systems were inconsistent. Cities like London and Paris suffered devastating outbreaks of disease, particularly during the Black Death in the 14th century. Efforts were made to regulate building materials, street widths, and waste removal. Some rulers attempted early zoning laws. Yet enforcement was inconsistent, and population density often overwhelmed planning efforts. By many measures, medieval urban infrastructure failed to protect public health. And yet, from those failures emerged essential principles: paved streets, municipal regulation, drainage systems, public wells, and eventually centralized sanitation. Modern urban planning, public health departments, and building codes trace their roots back to medieval attempts, sometimes desperate, often inadequate, to manage growing populations within confined walls. The solutions were incomplete, but the impulse to regulate urban space, to design cities consciously rather than let them sprawl unchecked, was firmly planted in the Middle Ages. Even fashion offers a revealing example. In the 14th century, European tailors developed fitted garments that departed from the loose drape styles of earlier centuries. Buttons, previously decorative, became functional fasteners. This allowed clothing to contour to the body more precisely. At first, these tightly fitted garments were controversial. Moralists criticized them as vain or immodest. Some regions attempted sumptuary laws, regulating who could wear certain fabrics, colors, or styles. Certain fashions quickly fell out of favor. Elaborate pointed shoes, exaggerated sleeves, and other extremes appeared briefly and disappeared. Yet the basic innovation, the tailored, fitted garment using buttons as functional closures, remained. Today, nearly every shirt, jacket, or coat continues this medieval development. The button, once a fashionable experiment, is now so ordinary that we rarely consider its origins. In its own time, it seemed radical, sometimes even socially disruptive. Now it is universal. Even agricultural technology followed a similar path. The heavy plow, introduced in parts of northern Europe during the early medieval period, allowed farmers to cultivate dense clay soils more effectively than earlier Roman-style plows. It required teams of oxen and significant coordination. It was expensive and impractical for some regions. In areas with lighter soils, it offered little advantage. In others, it required communal field arrangements to function efficiently. At first, adoption was uneven. In some communities, it likely appeared cumbersome, too heavy, too costly, too demanding of labor. Yet over time, in the fertile lands of northern Europe, it transformed agricultural productivity. This supported population growth, urbanization, and economic expansion. Modern mechanized farming is far removed from the wooden and iron plows of the 9th century. But the principle, reshaping tools to match environmental conditions, was decisively medieval. Even military technologies reveal the same pattern. Early gunpowder weapons entered Europe in the 14th century. The first cannons were unreliable, dangerous to operate, and inconsistent in performance. Many were more symbolic than strategically decisive. Traditional longbows and crossbows remained more dependable for decades. To some observers, early firearms must have seemed unstable novelties. Loud, smoky, expensive, and imprecise. Yet the underlying technology evolved. Metallurgy improved. Standardization increased. Within a few centuries, gunpowder weapons would permanently alter the structure of warfare and the design of fortifications. What began as a flawed experiment became the dominant force in military history for centuries to come. Across finance, timekeeping, urban planning, fashion, agriculture, and warfare, medieval Europe was filled with ideas that did not immediately succeed. Some collapsed financially, some underperformed technically, some triggered backlash or resistance, but innovation rarely moves in straight lines. The Middle Ages were not an era of stagnation. They were an era of trial and adaptation, where ideas were tested, abandoned, revived, and refined. And perhaps the most striking lesson is this: failure in one century may become foundation in another. What looked incomplete in a candlelit workshop could, over generations, shape the structure of the modern world. And in many cases, it already has. If we look more closely at medieval communication, we find another innovation that struggled in its own time but quietly shaped the future: the rise of paper and early printing techniques in Europe. Paper itself was not a European invention. It traveled slowly westward from China through the Islamic world, reaching parts of Spain and Italy by the 12th century. At first, parchment remained dominant. It was durable, familiar, and associated with religious authority. Paper, by contrast, was seen as cheaper and less prestigious. Many scribes distrusted it. Some believed it would not last. Others considered it unsuitable for sacred texts. Early European paper production was limited and uneven. Mills were expensive to build, and techniques were still being refined. For generations, paper remained secondary, useful for records, letters, and commercial accounts, but rarely for the most important manuscripts. In that sense, it appeared to fall short of replacing traditional materials. It was practical but not transformative. Yet paper dramatically lowered the cost of writing. As literacy expanded in cities and universities, demand for affordable materials grew. Administrative governments required records. Merchants required contracts. Scholars required copies of texts. By the time Johannes Gutenberg introduced movable type printing in the mid-15th century, paper was already in place as a scalable medium. Without those earlier centuries of hesitant adoption, of partial acceptance and skepticism, printing would not have spread as rapidly as it did. What seemed like an inferior substitute became the essential foundation for mass communication. Today, even in a digital age, the concept of inexpensive, reproducible written material traces directly back to those medieval experiments with pulp, water, and wooden frames. Another instructive example can be found in medieval medicine. Physicians in medieval Europe relied heavily on inherited classical theories, especially the system of the four humors. Treatments were based on balancing bodily fluids through diet, herbs, and sometimes bloodletting. Hospitals, often run by religious orders, focused as much on spiritual care as physical treatment. From a modern perspective, many medieval medical practices were ineffective. Some were even harmful. Epidemics such as the Black Death exposed the limits of contemporary understanding. Explanations ranged from miasma, bad air, to astrological alignments. In practical terms, medieval medicine often failed to cure the most devastating illnesses. And yet, within those limitations, important structures were forming. Universities established medical faculties. Licensing systems for physicians emerged in certain cities. Hospitals became permanent urban institutions rather than temporary shelters. Written medical texts circulated among scholars. The framework of professional medicine, training, certification, institutional care, solidified during this period. While treatments would evolve dramatically in later centuries, the organizational model endured. Modern healthcare systems, with their hospitals, trained practitioners, and regulated standards, owe a significant structural debt to medieval precedents. Even systems of law and governance reveal a similar pattern. In 1215, English barons compelled King John to accept the Magna Carta. At the time, it was not a sweeping declaration of universal rights. It was a negotiated document addressing specific grievances between the monarchy and the nobility. It was annulled, reissued, revised, and contested repeatedly. In its immediate context, it seemed unstable, more political compromise than lasting constitution. Many of its clauses became obsolete. Others applied narrowly to medieval landholding elites. Yet over centuries, the symbolic principle that rulers were subject to law gained strength. Legal scholars reinterpreted the document. Later political movements invoked it as precedent. Today, constitutional governance and the idea of legal limits on executive power draw partially from those early medieval struggles. The original document did not instantly transform society. In fact, its early implementation was inconsistent, but its core concept endured, evolved, and expanded. In architecture, too, the story repeats. The great Gothic cathedrals of the 12th and 13th centuries were technological marvels. Pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses allowed walls to rise higher and windows to expand dramatically. These structures required extraordinary investment, complex engineering, and decades, sometimes centuries, of construction. Not every cathedral project succeeded. Funding ran out. Political turmoil intervened. Some designs proved structurally unsound and required modification. To many towns, such projects must have seemed financially risky. Resources were poured into buildings that might never be completed. And yet, the engineering knowledge developed through these ambitious efforts permanently advanced architectural science. Techniques refined in cathedral building influenced later civic architecture, bridges, and eventually modern structural engineering. The visible grandeur may dominate our imagination, but beneath it lay countless adjustments, corrections, and partial failures. Medieval innovation was rarely efficient. It was iterative. Whether in finance, timekeeping, urban planning, clothing, agriculture, communication, medicine, law, or architecture, the Middle Ages reveal a pattern that challenges the stereotype of stagnation. Ideas emerged. They stumbled. They adapted. They reappeared in improved form. Failure in this context was not the opposite of progress. It was often part of it. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson of medieval products that seem to fail completely. History does not measure success in decades. It measures it in centuries. What appears flawed in one generation may become foundational in another. The medieval world, with all its limitations, laid groundwork that still quietly shapes daily life across the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and beyond. From the way we bank to how we measure time, to how cities are regulated and garments are fastened, echoes of medieval experimentation remain embedded in the modern world. The workshops and scriptoria, the counting houses and cathedral yards, these were not relics of a dark age. They were laboratories of long-term change. And in many cases, the products that seemed to fail completely never truly disappeared at all. We can see this long pattern of apparent failure and eventual endurance even in something as ordinary as eyeglasses. By the late 13th century, craftsmen in northern Italy began producing simple convex lenses mounted in wooden or bone frames. These early spectacles were designed primarily for aging monks and scholars who struggled with presbyopia, the natural weakening of close vision over time. At first, they were fragile and expensive. The lenses were imperfect, often filled with bubbles or distortions from the glass-making process. Frames had to be balanced carefully on the nose, since arms that hooked over the ears had not yet been developed. They slipped easily and broke often. To many people, spectacles must have seemed like a delicate novelty, useful for a small scholarly class, but hardly a transformative invention. And yet, even in that limited form, they extended working life. Scribes could copy manuscripts for longer years. Administrators could read contracts and accounts well into old age. Merchants could inspect goods and tally figures with greater accuracy. In the short term, spectacles did not change medieval society overnight. Literacy remained limited. Books were still expensive. Production was slow. But the principle that technology could compensate for natural human limitation was quietly revolutionary. Over centuries, lens grinding improved. Frames evolved. By the early modern period, spectacles were more widely available. Eventually, scientific study of optics expanded into microscopes and telescopes, opening entirely new fields of discovery. Today, corrective lenses, contact lenses, and laser eye surgery trace their lineage back to those imperfect medieval glass discs. What once seemed like a narrow, fragile aid for aging monks became a universal medical device used by billions. Another example lies in mechanical mills. Watermills had existed in Roman times, but in early medieval Europe their use expanded dramatically. By the 11th and 12th centuries, rivers across England and France were lined with mills for grinding grain, fulling cloth, and sawing timber. However, these machines were not always welcomed. Peasants were often required by local lords to use the manorial mill and pay a fee. Flooding, mechanical breakdowns, and disputes over water rights were common. Construction and maintenance demanded significant investment. In some areas, mills were criticized as tools of feudal control rather than engines of progress. Technically, too, they were inconsistent. Seasonal water flow could disrupt operations. Wooden components wore down quickly. Repairs were constant. And yet, the broader shift was profound. Mechanical power began replacing manual labor on a larger scale. Communities learned to harness natural forces systematically. The medieval watermill may not have represented industrialization in the modern sense, but it established a crucial idea. Energy could be captured and redirected to perform repetitive work. Windmills followed similar patterns, spreading across the Low Countries and parts of England. Like watermills, they were imperfect, weather-dependent, and costly, but they normalized the concept of machine-assisted production. Centuries later, steam engines and electric turbines would follow the same principle, vastly expanded in scale and reliability. The medieval mills often failed in daily operation. They broke, stalled, flooded, and sparked disputes. Yet the underlying shift toward mechanized energy endured and ultimately reshaped global economies. Even early universities fit this pattern of uncertain beginnings and long-term influence. Institutions such as Bologna, Paris, and Oxford emerged in the 12th and 13th centuries as communities of scholars rather than centralized campuses. There were no unified buildings at first, no standardized curricula across Europe, and frequent conflicts with local authorities. Students and teachers were mobile. Strikes occurred. Charters were revoked and renegotiated. Financial stability was fragile. To contemporary observers, these early universities may have appeared chaotic, experimental communities constantly negotiating their survival. And yet, they institutionalized higher learning in a durable way. Degrees were formalized. Academic disciplines were defined. Systems of lectures, disputations, and examinations became standardized. Though medieval scholarship was limited by its sources and worldview, the organizational structure of the university proved remarkably resilient. Modern higher education, from North America to Australia, continues to operate within frameworks first shaped in medieval Europe. The original institutions were unstable. Their intellectual conclusions were sometimes flawed, but their model endured. Across these examples, spectacles, mills, universities, the same pattern reappears. An innovation emerges within the specific social and economic limits of medieval Europe. The struggles. It appears narrow in scope, fragile, or incomplete. It may even generate resistance or controversy. In its own century, it can look like a partial failure. But history does not freeze at that moment. Improvement accumulates slowly. Supporting systems develop. Cultural acceptance grows. What once seemed marginal becomes normal. The Middle Ages were not defined by dramatic technological leaps each decade. Instead, they were defined by persistence, by incremental adjustments that only reveal their full significance across generations. And when we look around today at our glasses, our universities, our power grids, our financial systems, We are often looking at the distant descendants of medieval experiments that once appeared uncertain at best. The failures were real, but so was the quiet continuity that followed. We can continue this pattern into the world of written language itself, particularly the slow transformation from manuscript culture to standardized text. In medieval Europe, every book was copied by hand. Monks, scribes, and later professional copyists labored for months over a single volume. Errors were inevitable. Marginal notes sometimes slipped into the main body of text in later copies. Spelling varied widely because standardized orthography had not yet been established. To modern eyes, this system appears inefficient and unreliable. A single damaged manuscript could mean the loss of a text. Variations multiplied across regions. Knowledge traveled slowly. Even after the arrival of early printing in the 15th century, the transition was uneven. Some authorities distrusted printed works. Hand-copied manuscripts retained prestige. Early printed books themselves contained mistakes and required manual correction. For a time, printing did not immediately replace manuscript culture. It coexisted with it. The shift was gradual. In that transitional moment, printing might have seemed like an uncertain improvement. Faster, yes, but not yet fully refined. And yet, over time, the standardization made possible by print reshaped education, religion, science, and governance. Identical copies could circulate across continents. Debates could reference the same page numbers. Literacy could expand with access to more affordable texts. Today, the idea of fixed, consistent editions underpins everything from legal codes to academic research. Even digital publishing follows the principle of reproducible, standardized text first made viable through medieval and early modern experimentation. The early stages were imperfect, but the direction was irreversible. We see a similar story in maritime technology. Medieval shipbuilders across the Mediterranean and North Sea experimented constantly with hull design, sail configuration, and steering mechanisms. The stern post rudder, which gradually replaced side-mounted steering oars, improved navigation control. Multiple masts allowed ships to harness wind more efficiently. Yet medieval ships were still vulnerable. Storms claimed countless vessels. Navigation relied heavily on coastal landmarks and limited instruments. Long-distance voyages remained risky and slow. Many designs were regional and not easily adaptable. Some experiments failed outright, producing unstable or inefficient ships. But incremental improvements accumulated. The combination of hull refinement, improved rigging, and better steering laid the groundwork for the great voyages of exploration that would follow in the 15th and 16th centuries. In isolation, each medieval adjustment might have seemed modest or even flawed, but together, they shifted Europe's relationship with the sea. Modern global trade routes, container shipping, and international naval systems stand at the far end of a long chain that includes those early medieval shipyards. Even the concept of mechanical innovation itself, of systematically improving tools, strengthened during the Middle Ages. Guild systems regulated craft production in cities. Apprentices trained for years under masters, learning not only established techniques but also incremental refinements. Tools evolved slowly but steadily. Improved looms for weaving, better metalworking techniques, more efficient kilns for ceramics. Not every innovation was welcomed. Guilds sometimes resisted change to protect established practices. Political authorities intervened in trade. Markets fluctuated unpredictably. In some cases, technological improvements were delayed or suppressed. Yet the culture of craft specialization persisted. Skill was transmitted across generations. Techniques accumulated rather than disappearing entirely. By the time early modern industry began to accelerate, Europe already possessed centuries of embedded technical knowledge rooted in medieval workshops. It is tempting to divide history into sharp contrasts: medieval stagnation followed by Renaissance awakening, then industrial transformation. But reality is more gradual. The Middle Ages were not an era of constant triumph. Many products, systems, and institutions failed in visible ways. Banks collapsed, cities burned, medical theories faltered, machines broke. But beneath those setbacks, continuity remained. Ideas were rarely abandoned completely. They were adjusted, revived, repurposed. And perhaps that is why so many medieval failures still surround us today, not in their original forms, but in evolved versions refined across centuries. The clock tower that drifted off schedule became the precision instrument that coordinates satellites. The fragile spectacles perched on a monk's nose became modern ophthalmology. The unstable merchant bank became global finance. The narrow medieval street, once plagued by waste and congestion, inspired structured urban planning and sanitation reform. When viewed only in their immediate context, many medieval products seemed incomplete or unsuccessful. When viewed across the long arc of history, they were early chapters in stories still unfolding. And that perspective changes how we understand the Middle Ages, not as a static bridge between empires, but as a workshop of long-term change, where even apparent failures could become foundations for the modern world. If we turn to something even more ordinary, money itself, we find another medieval product that repeatedly faltered, yet never disappeared. Coinage in medieval Europe was unstable for much of the period. After the collapse of Roman authority in the West, uniform currency systems fragmented. Kings and local rulers minted their own coins, often reducing the precious metal content to stretch resources. Debasement was common. Trust fluctuated. Merchants sometimes weighed coins rather than relying on face value. Foreign currency circulated unevenly. In rural areas, barter persisted alongside coin use because reliable small denominations were scarce. From a practical standpoint, medieval monetary systems often failed to provide consistent stability. Inflation, shortage of silver, and political manipulation disrupted trade. Entire regions experienced periods where coin circulation slowed dramatically. Yet the fundamental concept of standardized, state-backed currency endured. Monarchs increasingly recognized that control over minting strengthened political authority. Over time, more centralized monetary policies emerged. England's silver penny, for example, maintained relatively consistent quality for long stretches, helping to stabilize domestic trade. Even when individual currencies failed, the broader system adapted. Gold florins from Florence and ducats from Venice gained international trust in the later Middle Ages, becoming widely accepted across Europe. Modern national currencies, central banking systems, and regulatory oversight evolved from these centuries of experimentation and instability. The medieval monetary world was unreliable by contemporary standards, but it laid essential groundwork for global finance. Another instructive example is mechanical record-keeping. Medieval administrators, both secular and ecclesiastical, faced growing complexity as kingdoms expanded. Taxation, land ownership, and legal disputes required documentation. Systems such as England's exchequer developed intricate accounting methods, using tallies and parchment rolls to track revenue. These systems were labor-intensive and vulnerable to human error. Records could be lost to fire, decay, or conflict. Standardization was limited, and duplication was rare. From a modern perspective, medieval bureaucracy appears fragile and inefficient. Yet it marked a decisive shift toward documented governance. Written records became authoritative. Contracts, charters, and court decisions were preserved for reference. The expectation that governments maintain archives and produce traceable documentation has its roots in these medieval practices. Today's digital databases, land registries, and tax systems are vastly more sophisticated, but they operate on the same foundational principle. Governance depends on reliable record-keeping. Even mechanical devices designed for calculation show early signs of this pattern. The medieval counting board and the use of counters for arithmetic allowed merchants and officials to perform complex transactions. Roman numerals made certain calculations cumbersome, but practical solutions emerged. By the late Middle Ages, the adoption of Hindu-Arabic numerals began spreading through commercial centers, though resistance remained strong in some regions. At first, these newer numeral systems were viewed with suspicion. Some authorities considered them easier to falsify. Traditional methods felt safer because they were familiar. Yet gradually, positional notation and zero transformed calculation. Commerce expanded alongside improved numerical literacy. The medieval transition was slow and uneven, but the outcome reshaped mathematics, science, and economics permanently. Even domestic architecture reveals similar developments. Medieval houses, especially in growing towns, were prone to fire. Timber framing, thatched roofs, and open hearths created constant danger. Major urban fires repeatedly devastated cities like London. Authorities introduced regulations, mandating stone construction in certain districts, restricting roof materials, widening streets to prevent rapid spread. Compliance was inconsistent. Enforcement varied. From one disaster to the next, it may have seemed that little progress had been made. And yet, each rebuilding phase incorporated lessons from the previous one. Over centuries, construction standards improved. Fire-resistant materials became more common. Urban design gradually accounted for risk mitigation. Modern building codes, zoning laws, and fire safety regulations evolved from these repeated medieval confrontations with structural vulnerability. Across finance, governance, mathematics, and architecture, the pattern remains consistent. Medieval products and systems often failed by immediate standards. They were unstable, inconsistent, and sometimes controversial. Political pressures and limited technology constrained their effectiveness. But the Middle Ages were not static. They were cumulative. Each setback produced adjustment. Each collapse generated refinement. Each fragile invention carried within it the possibility of future stability. When we consider the modern world, regulated currencies, standardized numbers, fire codes, administrative records, we are seeing not a sudden break from medieval Europe, but the matured form of its experiments. The products themselves may have faltered. The ideas behind them did not. And that quiet persistence, more than any single invention, may be the true legacy of medieval innovation. There is also a quieter, almost invisible medieval development that seemed limited in its own time, yet continues to shape modern life: the standardization of language. During much of the Middle Ages, Europe was linguistically fragmented. Latin served as the language of scholarship, law, and the church, but everyday speech varied widely from region to region. Even within a single kingdom, dialects could differ so dramatically that mutual understanding was difficult. Written vernacular languages existed, but spelling was inconsistent. There were no official dictionaries, no standardized grammar guides, and no expectation that words be spelled identically from one document to another. In practical terms, this created confusion. Legal documents could be misinterpreted. Trade agreements required careful clarification. Communication across long distances remained complicated. Early attempts to write in English, French, German, or other vernacular languages did not immediately create uniform standards. In fact, the diversity of spelling often increased as literacy slowly spread beyond clerical elites. To a medieval observer, linguistic standardization may not have appeared urgent or even possible. Regional identity was strong, and centralized control was limited. Yet gradual forces were at work. Royal administrations began issuing documents in vernacular languages to reach broader populations. Poets and authors gained recognition beyond their immediate regions. The growth of universities and urban centers created pressure for more consistent forms of communication. By the late Middle Ages, especially in England after the 14th century, certain dialects, such as the London variety of Middle English, gained prominence through political and economic influence. The arrival of printing further accelerated this process. Printers preferred consistency to reduce typesetting complexity. Repeated editions of texts helped stabilize spelling patterns. What began as scattered, inconsistent written forms slowly solidified into recognizable national languages. Today, standardized English, French, and other European languages underpin global communication, international law, and digital information exchange. While modern spelling reforms and dictionaries came much later, the medieval shift toward writing in the vernacular was essential groundwork. In its early stages, it did not seem transformative. It appeared messy, fragmented, and unstable, but it marked the beginning of linguistic consolidation that would shape entire nations. We can also see this gradual evolution in the development of representative assemblies. Across medieval Europe, rulers increasingly consulted councils of nobles, clergy, and sometimes townspeople. England's Parliament, France's Estates General, and various regional assemblies emerged not as democratic institutions in the modern sense, but as pragmatic solutions to governance challenges, especially taxation. These assemblies were inconsistent. They were often summoned irregularly. Representation was limited to elites. Many had little enduring power, and some faded into irrelevance for long periods. At the time, they may have appeared temporary tools rather than lasting institutions. Conflicts between monarchs and assemblies were frequent. Authority shifted back and forth. In some regions, centralized monarchy eventually overshadowed representative bodies entirely. Yet the precedent that rulers could not govern entirely in isolation, that consent and consultation had value, took root. Over centuries, this idea evolved. Political crises in the early modern period forced renegotiations of authority. Later constitutional frameworks drew on medieval precedents to justify broader representation. Modern parliamentary systems in the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia all trace part of their institutional ancestry to these medieval assemblies. The original bodies were limited, unstable, and often ineffective by contemporary democratic standards. But the institutional memory endured. Even systems of weights and measures reflect this pattern. Medieval markets struggled with inconsistency. A pound or a bushel might vary between towns. Fraud and misunderstanding were common. Local authorities attempted regulation, but enforcement was uneven. Trade disputes highlighted the need for standard reference points. Over time, monarchs and city governments introduced more uniform measures to facilitate commerce. The process was slow and contested. Regional traditions resisted change. Standardization required administrative capacity and political will. But the long-term trajectory was clear: trade benefits from shared standards. Modern systems of measurement, whether imperial or metric, depend on precise definitions recognized across entire nations and, in many cases, internationally. That impulse toward measurable consistency has medieval roots in market regulation and commercial law. Across language, governance, and trade standards, the Middle Ages reveal not dramatic breakthroughs but gradual consolidation. At each stage, the product or system seemed imperfect. Dialects clashed. Assemblies struggled. Measures varied. Nothing appeared fully formed. Yet beneath that apparent disorder, structures were stabilizing. When we step back and consider the broader picture, a consistent theme emerges. Medieval Europe was not defined solely by cathedrals or castles, nor by isolated inventions. It was defined by processes of standardization, processes of institutionalization, processes of refinement through repeated trial. Many medieval products failed to achieve immediate perfection. Some collapsed outright. Others survived only in limited forms. But they initiated movements toward systems that we now consider foundational. Stable currencies, written records, standardized language, regulated markets, representative governance. The Middle Ages were not an endpoint. They were a long, uneven beginning. And in that beginning, even the products that seemed to fail completely were quietly shaping the frameworks of the modern world. Another revealing example of a medieval product that seemed limited, even disappointing in its own time, is the early use of mechanical clocks inside domestic spaces. As we discussed earlier, large public clock towers appeared in European cities by the 14th century. They were civic statements, expensive, symbolic, and often inaccurate. But smaller mechanical clocks, designed for private ownership, emerged much later and were initially rare and unreliable. These early household clocks were heavy, spring-driven devices that required frequent winding and constant maintenance. They drifted significantly and lacked minute hands for precise measurement. For most people, they offered little practical advantage over church bells or natural daylight cycles. In that sense, the domestic mechanical clock could easily have been dismissed as unnecessary, a luxury curiosity for wealthy households rather than a functional tool. But its quiet impact unfolded over generations. Gradually, time became more than a broad rhythm marked by sunrise and sunset. It became segmented, measurable, divisible. Work routines adapted. Commercial agreements referenced specific hours. Urban life synchronized around shared expectations of punctuality. The medieval domestic clock did not instantly reorganize society, but it introduced a new relationship with time, one that valued precision and regularity. Today, modern economies depend on exact coordination down to seconds and milliseconds. Transportation networks, financial markets, and digital communications operate within highly regulated temporal frameworks. That transformation began not with perfect instruments, but with flawed medieval mechanisms that slowly reshaped cultural attitudes toward time itself. We can also observe this pattern in medieval road systems. After the decline of Roman authority, many of the empire's carefully engineered roads deteriorated. Maintenance lapsed, bridges collapsed, travel became slower and more hazardous in certain regions. Medieval rulers lacked the centralized resources to maintain infrastructure on the Roman scale. Local authorities patched routes where possible, and trade networks adapted to changing conditions. At first glance, this appears as regression rather than innovation. However, by the High Middle Ages, expanding commerce revived interest in reliable overland travel. Market towns grew along established routes. Toll systems funded bridge repairs. Pilgrimage roads connecting religious centers received attention and investment. Although medieval roads rarely matched Roman engineering standards, they represented a renewed commitment to regional connectivity. They linked emerging urban centers and facilitated internal trade. In time, these revived networks supported the growth of national economies. Later road-building efforts in the early modern and industrial periods expanded upon medieval foundations. Modern highways and rail lines follow corridors shaped by centuries of incremental development. The medieval road system may have appeared inadequate compared to Roman precedent. Yet it sustained the gradual reintegration of European economies. Even financial insurance emerged tentatively during the Middle Ages. Maritime trade carried enormous risk. Ships could be lost to storms, piracy, or navigational error. To mitigate these dangers, merchants developed early forms of marine insurance in Italian trading cities. At first, these agreements were informal and limited in scope. Legal frameworks were inconsistent. Enforcement depended heavily on trust and local custom. Insurance contracts did not eliminate risk. They sometimes generated disputes. In unstable political climates, they could fail entirely. But the concept, spreading risk across multiple investors, proved durable. Modern insurance industries, from property to health to global reinsurance markets, operate on principles first formalized in medieval commercial centers. What began as a narrow solution to maritime uncertainty became a cornerstone of modern economic stability. Across these examples, domestic clocks, roads, marine insurance, the pattern holds steady. Medieval products often seemed partial. They lacked the scale, precision, or reliability we now associate with success. Their creators operated within technological limits and political fragmentation. Failures were visible and frequent, yet the underlying ideas endured because they addressed fundamental human needs: coordination, connectivity, security. The Middle Ages rarely delivered immediate perfection. Instead, they provided continuity. The clock ticked imperfectly, but it ticked. The road eroded, but it carried travelers. The insurance contract faltered, but it spread risk. History often celebrates dramatic turning points: the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, the industrial age. But those moments did not emerge from emptiness. They rested upon medieval experimentation, sometimes hesitant, sometimes unstable, often misunderstood. When we describe certain medieval products as having failed completely, we are often judging them by modern standards. In their own context, they were steps, small, uneven steps, but without them, the later strides would not have been possible. And so the legacy of medieval Europe is not merely one of castles and chronicles. It is a legacy of persistence, of imperfect inventions that quietly shaped the rhythms, systems, and safeguards of the world we inhabit today. The failures were real, but so was the foundation they left behind. If we look even deeper into daily medieval life, we find another product that struggled repeatedly before becoming indispensable: the book as a personal possession. For much of the Middle Ages, books were rare and costly. Hand-copied manuscripts required animal parchment, skilled labor, and months of careful transcription. A single volume could represent a significant financial investment, sometimes equivalent to the price of land or livestock. As a result, most books were owned by monasteries, universities, or wealthy patrons. The idea of widespread private book ownership simply did not exist. Even as literacy slowly expanded in towns during the 13th and 14th centuries, the cost barrier remained high. Attempts to produce smaller, more portable manuscripts, such as pocket Bibles, reduced material use, but not enough to make books broadly affordable. In that sense, the medieval book market seemed limited in reach. The product itself, while culturally important, failed to penetrate society at scale. Yet incremental changes were already underway. Paper production increased. Professional urban scribes began competing with monastic scriptoria. Demand from merchants, lawyers, and administrators grew. Texts beyond theology, romances, legal manuals, medical guides circulated more widely. When printing technology arrived in the 15th century, it entered a market already primed by centuries of gradual demand growth. The medieval book may not have democratized knowledge immediately, but it established the expectation that knowledge could be collected, preserved, and transmitted materially. Today's global publishing industry, digital libraries, and online archives all reflect that medieval shift toward durable, portable knowledge storage. The original product was expensive and limited. The concept proved transformative. We see something similar in the medieval development of double-entry bookkeeping. Merchants in Italian city-states, particularly in Florence and Venice, faced increasing commercial complexity as trade networks expanded across the Mediterranean and beyond. Managing accounts through simple lists became inadequate. Gradually, merchants refined accounting methods that tracked both debits and credits systematically. By the 14th and 15th centuries, double-entry bookkeeping began to formalize. At first, these methods were confined largely to commercial elites. They required mathematical literacy not yet widespread. Mistakes were still common. There was no universal accounting standard. To outsiders, this may have appeared like a niche commercial tool rather than a broader innovation. But the principle, recording financial transactions in balanced, cross-reference systems, proved foundational. Modern corporate finance, government budgets, and international trade accounting all rely on structured bookkeeping systems descended from medieval practice. The early versions were imperfect and localized, yet the underlying logic reshaped economic organization permanently. Even something as familiar as the chimney reflects medieval adaptation through trial and error. In early medieval homes, Smoke from central hearths escaped through holes in the roof or open spaces in thatched ceilings. Indoor air quality was poor. Fire hazards were constant. The gradual introduction of masonry chimneys in the later Middle Ages improved ventilation and safety. However, early chimneys were not universally adopted. Construction costs were high. Some designs functioned poorly, causing smoke backflow or structural instability. It took generations of architectural refinement before chimneys became standard in European homes. At first, they may have seemed like expensive modifications with mixed results, but their long-term impact was significant. Chimneys allowed for multi-story construction, improved interior comfort, and reduced fire risk. They altered domestic architecture and urban planning. Modern heating systems and ventilation design evolved far beyond those early stone shafts, but the principle of controlled indoor airflow traces back to medieval experimentation. Across books, bookkeeping, and chimneys, we again encounter the same rhythm. Medieval products often failed to deliver immediate universal transformation. Their adoption was uneven. Their designs were incomplete. Their markets were limited. Yet they introduced structural changes, ways of organizing information, managing resources, shaping living space that accumulated power over time. It is easy to focus on what medieval Europe lacked: industrial machinery, advanced medicine, rapid transportation. But it is more revealing to notice what it was building quietly beneath those limitations. The Middle Ages were not defined by finished systems. They were defined by beginnings. Beginnings of standardized knowledge. Beginnings of systematic finance. Beginnings of safer domestic design. Each product, judged alone in its century, might have seemed partial or even unsuccessful. But across the span of generations, those partial efforts became pillars. And perhaps that is the central insight of this entire exploration. Medieval products did not need to succeed immediately to matter. They needed only to persist long enough to be refined. In that persistence, the foundations of the modern world were laid, not in sudden breakthroughs, but in steady, imperfect steps forward. As we move toward the quieter corners of medieval life, even food preservation reveals a similar story of trial, limitation, and long-term influence. In a world without refrigeration, medieval households relied on salting, smoking, drying, fermenting, and pickling to preserve meat, fish, grains, and vegetables. These methods were not new. Many dated back to antiquity, but medieval Europe depended on them heavily, especially during winter months or religious fasting seasons. The results were inconsistent. Salted meat could spoil if improperly cured. Stored grain attracted pests. Fermented products varied in quality. Famine was never far from possibility when harvests failed. From a modern standpoint, medieval food preservation often seems unreliable and nutritionally limited. Diets lacked variety during colder months. Storage techniques did not eliminate risk of contamination. And yet, the systematic refinement of these methods shaped global cuisine and agricultural trade. Salted cod from the North Atlantic became a major export commodity. Smoked and cured meats developed into regional specialties. Fermentation techniques produced durable foods such as hard cheeses and preserved vegetables that could travel long distances. These preservation systems supported urban growth by enabling food to move beyond immediate harvest zones. Modern refrigeration transformed food storage, but many preservation traditions remain central to culinary culture. Pickled foods, Cured meats, aged cheeses, and dried grains are not relics. They are direct continuations of medieval necessity turned into enduring practice. Even in warfare beyond weaponry itself, logistical systems followed this pattern of imperfect beginnings. Medieval armies were often poorly supplied. Campaigns depended heavily on foraging and local requisition. Supply lines were fragile, and coordination between units could break down easily. Military organization lacked standardized provisioning systems on the scale later seen in early modern standing armies. In many campaigns, logistical shortcomings led to failure more than battlefield tactics did. Yet medieval rulers gradually recognized the importance of structured supply. Contracts with merchants for food delivery, record-keeping for troop payments, and organized storage facilities began to appear. While still inconsistent, these developments marked early steps toward centralized military administration. Modern armed forces rely on highly sophisticated logistics networks, ensuring steady supply across continents. Those systems evolved from centuries of recognizing and attempting to correct the weaknesses visible in medieval campaigns. Even leisure and recreation offer unexpected examples. Medieval board games such as chess and backgammon spread widely across Europe. Chess, in particular, arrived from the Islamic world and India, adapting its rules and symbolism to European culture. Early versions of the game differed from the modern form. Pieces moved differently. Strategies evolved slowly. The queen, now the most powerful piece, was originally far weaker. For generations, chess was a courtly pastime rather than a universal hobby. In its medieval form, it was complex but limited in reach. Yet the enduring structure of the game, strategy based on defined rules, symbolic hierarchy, and mental discipline, persisted and expanded. Standardized rules in later centuries allowed global competition. Today, chess is played worldwide, from classrooms to international tournaments, its medieval evolution still visible in the names and movements of its pieces. Across food preservation, military logistics, and even recreational games, we again see a pattern of early limitation paired with long-term durability. Medieval products and systems were constrained by available knowledge, technology, and political fragmentation. They often failed to achieve reliability or universality in their own era. But they introduced frameworks for sustaining populations through winter, frameworks for organizing armies beyond local feudal levies, frameworks for structured intellectual competition and leisure. Over centuries, those frameworks matured. It is tempting to evaluate history through dramatic success stories, the inventions that changed everything overnight. But the Middle Ages remind us that transformation often begins in modest, imperfect forms. A salted fish stored for winter, a ledger tracking supplies for a campaign, a carved chess piece moving one square at a time. None of these seemed revolutionary on their own. Yet together, they contributed to patterns of organization, preservation, and intellectual engagement that continue to shape modern societies. When we consider medieval products that failed completely, we often mean that they did not deliver immediate, visible transformation. But history is patient, and the Middle Ages, far from being defined by failure, were defined by continuity, by the steady refinement of ideas that would outlast their original limitations. In that long view, even the most fragile medieval experiment could become part of a structure still standing today. As we draw further into the fabric of medieval life, Even something as simple as the calendar reveals a product that seemed settled, yet was quietly imperfect. Throughout the Middle Ages, Europe relied on the Julian calendar, introduced under Julius Caesar in 45 BCE. By medieval standards, it functioned adequately. It structured religious observances, agricultural cycles, and civic life. Feast days, saints' days, and market days were organized around it. Yet the Julian calendar contained a small mathematical inaccuracy. Its calculation of the solar year was slightly too long. Over centuries, this error accumulated, causing seasonal drift. By the later Middle Ages, the discrepancy between calendar dates and astronomical reality was becoming noticeable. For medieval society, this was not an immediate crisis. Agricultural rhythms still followed climate and experience more than strict astronomical precision. But for church authorities, who relied on accurate calculation of Easter and other movable feasts, the drift posed a growing concern. Attempts to address the issue during the medieval period were limited. Astronomers identified the problem, but political and institutional coordination across Europe was difficult. In its medieval form, the calendar system appeared stable yet flawed, sufficient for daily life, but technically inaccurate. It would not be fully corrected until the Gregorian reform of 1582, well after the medieval period. Even then, adoption was uneven and politically charged. But the medieval recognition of calendrical drift demonstrated something important: an increasing commitment to aligning human systems with precise observation of the natural world. Today, global timekeeping systems rely on astronomical calculation and atomic precision. The medieval calendar did not collapse, but it quietly revealed the necessity of refinement. We can also look at medieval postal systems. Communication across long distances was slow and uncertain. Royal courts and monasteries relied on messengers traveling by horse or on foot. There was no universal public postal service. Letters could be delayed, lost, or intercepted. In many regions, only governments or large institutions could afford regular courier networks. For ordinary people, written communication beyond local areas was rare. From a modern perspective, this system appears inefficient and exclusive. Yet structured messenger routes, particularly within royal administrations, laid the groundwork for later postal systems. Relay stations improved travel speed. Written correspondence became increasingly important in governance and commerce. By the early modern period, more formal postal services emerged from these medieval precedents. Modern global mail systems, and even digital communication networks, operate on the principle that messages can move reliably across vast distances through organized relay systems. The medieval version was slow and fragile, but it established expectation that written communication could connect distant communities in structured ways. Even medieval taxation systems fit within this broader pattern. Rulers frequently struggled to collect revenue effectively. Taxation was often irregular, negotiated, and resisted. Record-keeping limitations created opportunities for evasion or corruption. From a governance standpoint, medieval fiscal systems often appeared unstable and incomplete. Yet the repeated need to fund wars, infrastructure, and administration forced rulers to develop more systematic methods. Surveys such as England's Domesday Book in 1086 attempted comprehensive land assessment. Later tax rolls documented property and income more thoroughly. Though imperfect, these efforts marked a significant shift toward structured state finance. Modern taxation systems, with standardized reporting, property registries, and centralized oversight, descend from these early administrative experiments. Across calendars, communication networks, and taxation systems, the same theme emerges once more. Medieval products and institutions were rarely flawless. They operated within limited technological and political frameworks. Errors accumulated. Systems drifted. Implementation varied from region to region. Yet the underlying direction was toward organization, toward measurable time, toward traceable communication, toward documented revenue. The Middle Ages did not deliver the polished systems we recognize today, but they initiated processes of coordination that later centuries would refine dramatically. Perhaps the most striking lesson from all of this is not about any single invention. It is about resilience. Medieval Europe was a landscape of fragmentation, political divisions, regional identities, technological limits. And yet, within that fragmentation, ideas persisted long enough to mature. Products failed by immediate standards, but the concepts behind them endured. When we glance at a calendar on a smartphone, send an email across continents, or file a tax return through a centralized system, we are participating in structures whose distant ancestors can be found in medieval Europe. Those ancestors were imperfect, but they were persistent. And in the long arc of history, persistence often matters more than perfection. If we take one final look at medieval Europe through this lens, even the concept of personal identity documentation begins to emerge as another quiet, imperfect innovation. In much of the early Middle Ages, identity was local and personal. People were known within their village or town by reputation, family ties, and memory. Formal identification papers were rare outside of specific legal or ecclesiastical contexts. As trade expanded and populations became more mobile during the High Middle Ages, this local familiarity was no longer sufficient. Merchants traveled between cities. Pilgrims crossed borders. Students moved from one university town to another. To manage this movement, documents such as letters of safe conduct, charters, and seals became increasingly important. A seal attached to a document verified authority. A written letter could confirm status or permission. Yet these systems were inconsistent. Seals could be forged. Documents could be lost. Literacy levels varied, limiting verification. From a modern perspective, medieval identity systems appear fragile and easily manipulated. And yet they represent an important shift. Authority began to attach not only to personal recognition but to recorded documentation. Identity could be represented symbolically through wax seals, signatures, and eventually written names tied to property and rights. Over centuries, this concept expanded into passports, licenses, and legal identification systems that structure modern citizenship. The medieval letter of safe conduct did not resemble a modern passport, but it introduced the principle that identity and permission could be formally documented and recognized beyond immediate local communities. Even the development of mechanical innovation in warfare logistics, beyond weapons themselves, offers one more example. Medieval fortifications evolved in response to changing siege technologies. Early stone castles were designed primarily to resist ladders, rams, and basic siege engines. As gunpowder artillery improved toward the end of the Middle Ages, traditional high walls proved vulnerable. In their final centuries, many medieval castles failed to withstand sustained cannon fire. At first glance, this appears as technological obsolescence rather than success. But these failures drove architectural innovation. Lower, thicker walls and angled bastions emerged in response, leading to the Tres Italien style of fortification in the early modern period. The medieval castle did not survive unchanged, yet its structural evolution, shaped by visible shortcomings, informed centuries of military engineering. Failure prompted redesign, and redesign produced systems that lasted far longer. When we step back from individual examples, banks and books, clocks and chimneys, roads and record-keeping, calendars and communication, we begin to see the Middle Ages differently. It was not an era defined by finished achievements. It was an era defined by continuity under constraint. Technological progress was incremental because resources were limited. Political fragmentation slowed coordination. Religious authority influenced social acceptance of new ideas. But within those limits, experimentation never ceased. Products appeared. Some faltered. Others stabilized. Many seemed to fail entirely in their original form. Yet few ideas vanished completely. Instead, they lingered, refined in workshops, debated in universities, adjusted in marketplaces, rebuilt after fires or wars. That quiet persistence is perhaps the true legacy of medieval innovation. When modern viewers in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, or Australia consider the medieval world, it is often imagined as distant and disconnected from daily life. But in reality, much of what structures modern existence has medieval roots. Not in perfected form, but in embryonic form. The medieval product that failed to dominate its century may have shaped the next one. The flawed mechanism, the unstable institution, the incomplete system, each carried within it a principle that endured. History does not always reward immediate success. Sometimes it rewards survival. And the Middle Ages, far from being a historical pause between greater eras, were a long chapter of survival, of ideas that outlasted their own imperfections and quietly built the foundations of the modern world. As we reach the final stretch of this exploration, it becomes clear that the Middle Ages were not simply a catalog of inventions that either succeeded or failed. They were a testing ground for systems that required time, often centuries, to mature. Consider one last example: the development of public institutions of charity. Medieval Europe faced recurring hardship, famine, disease, war, and economic instability. In response, religious communities and urban authorities established hospitals, almshouses, and poor relief systems. These institutions were often modest in scale and inconsistent in operation. Funding depended on donations or local taxation. Oversight varied widely. From a modern standpoint, medieval welfare systems appear fragmented and limited. They did not eliminate poverty. They did not provide universal coverage. Many vulnerable people remained unsupported. And yet, they introduced a powerful institutional idea: that communities bore responsibility for structured care of the poor and sick. Charitable endowments became formalized. Administrators kept records. Urban governments increasingly coordinated relief efforts rather than relying solely on informal charity. These systems were imperfect and frequently overwhelmed by crisis, but they established precedents for organized social assistance. Modern public health systems, social welfare programs, and charitable foundations operate on principles shaped in part by medieval practice. The belief that aid can be institutional rather than purely personal. We might also reflect on the medieval marketplace itself. Town markets were regulated spaces. Authorities monitored weights and measures, inspected goods, and enforced certain standards. These efforts were not always effective. Fraud persisted. Enforcement could be uneven or corrupt. Yet the concept of a regulated commercial environment, where transactions occurred under recognized rules, took firmer shape during the Middle Ages. Market charters granted towns the right to host regular fairs. Legal frameworks addressed disputes between buyers and sellers. Commercial law evolved gradually to support expanding trade. While medieval markets lacked the scale and sophistication of modern economies, they contributed to the idea that commerce benefits from structure and oversight. Today's consumer protection laws, regulatory agencies, and standardized trade practices echo those early attempts to bring order to exchange. Across charity, commerce, infrastructure, governance, finance, communication, and domestic life, the pattern remains remarkably consistent. Medieval products and systems often seemed incomplete in their own era. They were constrained by limited scientific understanding, fragmented political authority, and technological simplicity. Many did, in a narrow sense, fail. They failed to deliver precision. They failed to achieve universal adoption. They failed to solve every problem they were designed to address. But failure in history is rarely absolute. More often, it is transitional. The medieval clock was inaccurate, but it introduced measured time. The early bank collapsed, but it normalized credit. The manuscript was rare, but it preserved knowledge. The chimney smoked, but it redefined interior space. The assembly was limited, but it seeded representation. Each of these products existed within a specific historical moment. Judged only by that moment, they appear partial, fragile, even disappointing. Judged across centuries, they appear foundational. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson behind medieval products that seem to fail completely. Innovation does not always look like success at first. Sometimes it looks like inconvenience. Sometimes like controversy. Sometimes like collapse. But if the underlying idea addresses a lasting human need, coordination, security, knowledge, fairness, efficiency, it tends to survive. It adapts. It reappears. It strengthens. The Middle Ages were not a pause between greater achievements. They were a long period of preparation where essential frameworks were tested under difficult conditions. When we examine our modern world, the regulated markets, structured governments, financial systems, public institutions, standardized language, documented identity, synchronized time, we are seeing the matured descendants of medieval experimentation. The products themselves may have stumbled, but the ideas endured. And in the end, endurance is often the truest measure of historical success. If you've stayed with this journey through medieval Europe, you've seen that what appears to be failure in one century can become foundation in another. That long perspective is what makes history so powerful and so quietly relevant to our daily lives. And there is always more beneath the surface, waiting to be explored. As we take one final, wider view of medieval Europe, it becomes clear that what we often label as failed products were rarely dead ends. More often, they were early drafts of systems the modern world now depends on. Think for a moment about the medieval experiment with centralized record archives. In the early Middle Ages, many agreements were oral. Land transfers, feudal obligations, and legal settlements relied heavily on witnesses and communal memory. Written charters existed, but storage was inconsistent. Documents were vulnerable to fire, war, decay, or simple misplacement. As kingdoms stabilized during the High Middle Ages, rulers began to recognize the importance of preserving documentation systematically. Royal chanceries expanded. Copies of charters were stored in cathedrals and castles. Legal precedents were written down and retained for reference. These early archives were far from secure by modern standards. Buildings burned. Wars destroyed collections. Political transitions sometimes led to deliberate erasure of records. From a contemporary perspective, medieval archiving appears fragile and incomplete. And yet, the idea that governance requires durable documentation, stored, cataloged, and retrievable, took firm root. Modern national archives, digital data centers, land registries, and court systems all rely on principles first embedded during the medieval period. That authority is strengthened by preserved records, and that institutional memory must outlast individual lifetimes. The medieval archive may have been vulnerable parchment in a wooden chest, but it represented a turning point toward bureaucratic continuity. We can also consider medieval experimentation with mechanical automation beyond mills, particularly in clockwork and small-scale devices. Inventors in the later Middle Ages created intricate mechanical automata for cathedrals and courts. Moving figures that struck bells on the hour, astronomical clocks displaying planetary motions, and complex geared systems fascinated observers. These devices were costly and often delicate. Maintenance required skilled craftsmen. Many broke down after years of use. They were novelties rather than necessities. In practical terms, they did not transform economic productivity, but they demonstrated something significant: that complex, interlocking mechanical systems could replicate predictable patterns of motion. The intellectual leap required to design such machines, thinking in terms of gears, ratios, and regulated force, laid groundwork for later mechanical engineering. Centuries later, that same logic would underpin industrial machinery, printing presses, and eventually modern engines. The medieval automaton may have seemed ornamental, even frivolous, yet it cultivated mechanical imagination. Even the development of contract law reveals the same pattern of imperfect beginnings. As trade expanded, merchants required enforceable agreements. Medieval courts began formalizing contract principles, recognizing written agreements, and establishing procedures for dispute resolution. Enforcement was uneven. Jurisdictional conflicts between church courts and secular courts complicated matters. Travel delays hindered legal proceedings. In many cases, contracts were difficult to enforce across long distances. But the structure was there. The recognition that agreements could be codified, adjudicated, and enforced beyond personal trust marked a crucial institutional shift. Modern commercial law, spanning continents and backed by international arbitration, rests upon foundations shaped in medieval courtrooms. The early system faltered frequently, but its underlying premise endured: that structured law can sustain complex economic relationships. If we gather all of these threads together, archives, mechanical devices, legal contracts, financial systems, timekeeping, infrastructure, communication, we begin to see a different image of the Middle Ages. Not a stagnant world waiting for Renaissance brilliance. Not a dark interlude between empires, but a long, steady process of system building under constraint. Medieval Europe lacked modern scientific tools. It lacked global connectivity. It lacked industrial power, but it possessed continuity. Ideas were rarely perfected in a single generation. Instead, they were adjusted slowly. Craftsmen refined techniques passed down from masters. Scholars preserved and debated inherited knowledge. Rulers experimented with administrative reforms, sometimes failing, sometimes stabilizing. From the outside, many of these efforts appeared to collapse. Banks failed. Castles became obsolete. Medical theories proved inaccurate. Roads deteriorated. Yet none of these failures erased the underlying pursuit of structure and improvement. And that may be the most important insight of all. When we describe medieval products as having failed completely, we are often observing only the first chapter of a much longer story. The Middle Ages remind us that progress is rarely dramatic in its earliest form. It is often subtle, uneven, and difficult to measure. A fragile pair of spectacles, an inaccurate mechanical clock, parchment archive vulnerable to flame, a local assembly with limited authority. Each seems modest in isolation, but together, they represent humanity's persistent effort to organize time, knowledge, power, and risk. Modern life, with its synchronized schedules, legal frameworks, financial institutions, documented identities, regulated markets, and global communication, did not appear suddenly. It emerged from centuries of refinement, and many of those centuries were medieval. So the next time we think about the Middle Ages, it may be worth remembering that what looked like failure was often simply the beginning. The products may not have conquered their century, but their ideas conquered the future. And that quiet endurance is perhaps the most remarkable legacy medieval Europe left behind. As we come to the closing reflections on medieval products that seem to fail completely, it is worth stepping back from individual examples and considering something broader: the medieval mindset toward improvement itself. One of the most persistent misconceptions about the Middle Ages is that innovation was rare or even discouraged. Certainly, tradition carried enormous weight. Guilds guarded techniques. Religious authority shaped intellectual boundaries. Political fragmentation slowed widespread adoption of change. And yet, across centuries, medieval society demonstrated a steady willingness to adapt tools and systems when necessity demanded it. Take agriculture once more, but from a structural perspective rather than a single invention. Medieval farmers refined crop rotation systems, particularly the three-field system that spread widely in Northern Europe. Instead of planting 2 fields and leaving 1 fallow every other year, land was divided into 3 sections: 1 for winter crops, 1 for spring crops, and 1 left fallow. This increased productivity without exhausting soil completely. In its early stages, the system required coordination among communities. It depended on shared schedules and cooperation in open-field villages. Not every region adopted it immediately. Climatic differences and social structures influenced uptake. It was not a dramatic invention like the steam engine. It did not eliminate famine. Harvest failures still occurred, but it represented optimization, careful refinement of existing practice. Over time, such incremental improvements in agriculture supported population growth, urbanization, and commercial expansion. The medieval farmer was not inventing modern agronomy. but he was participating in a culture of gradual adjustment that would eventually feed expanding societies. We can also reflect on medieval experimentation in financial partnerships. Beyond banking houses, merchants developed structures such as the commenda, a contract in which one partner provided capital and another conducted a voyage or trade mission. Profits were shared according to agreed terms. These arrangements were not always successful. Ships sank. Political instability disrupted trade. Disputes arose over profit calculation. Yet the concept of limited partnership, separating investment from management, proved durable. Modern corporate structures, venture capital arrangements, and shareholder models all echo this medieval approach to shared risk and distributed responsibility. The medieval commenda did not look like a multinational corporation, but it introduced a scalable model for pooling capital and dividing accountability. Even the spread of written vernacular literature fits within this pattern of underestimated influence. Medieval authors such as Geoffrey Chaucer in England or Dante Alighieri in Italy chose to write in local languages rather than Latin. At the time, this choice was controversial in certain scholarly circles. Latin was the language of prestige and tradition. Writing in the vernacular may have seemed limiting, less scholarly, less universal. But over generations, vernacular literature strengthened national linguistic identity. It broadened readership. It encouraged literacy beyond clerical elites. The decision to write in English, Italian, French, or German did not immediately create modern nations, but it shaped cultural cohesion in ways that would resonate centuries later. When we observe these examples together, agricultural systems, partnership contracts, vernacular writing, we notice something consistent. Medieval innovation was rarely about sudden transformation. It was about sustainability, about finding workable solutions within constraints, about balancing tradition with gradual change. Many medieval products did not dominate their own time. They faced resistance. They operated imperfectly. They were vulnerable to political disruption. But they were not static. They evolved. And that evolution was often quiet enough to escape dramatic historical narratives. When modern audiences think of innovation, they often imagine rapid disruption, technologies that instantly reshape economies or societies. The medieval world operated differently. Change was measured in lifetimes, not quarters. Tools improved generation by generation. Institutions stabilized across centuries. Ideas persisted even when their first implementations faltered. In that sense, what appeared to be failure was often incubation. A flawed clock mechanism incubated precision engineering. An unstable bank incubated global finance. A fragile manuscript culture incubated mass literacy. An imperfect assembly incubated parliamentary governance. The Middle Ages remind us that history does not move only through dramatic breakthroughs. It also moves through patient accumulation. The world we inhabit today, structured, regulated, interconnected, rests on systems that required centuries to refine. And many of those centuries were medieval. So perhaps the phrase failed completely deserves reconsideration, because very few medieval products truly vanished without trace. Most left behind a principle, a method, or an institutional memory. And those remnants were enough. Enough for later generations to rebuild, improve, and expand. In that long view, the Middle Ages were not defined by failure. They were defined by endurance. And endurance, more than immediate success, is what allowed medieval ideas to shape the foundations of the modern world. As we reach the true end of this long reflection, it may help to consider why medieval failures feel so striking to modern audiences in the first place. Part of the answer lies in perspective. We tend to judge the past by outcomes we already know. We see the precision of atomic clocks and forget the drifting gears of the first mechanical towers. We see stable national currencies and forget the debased coins and bankrupt merchant houses. We see constitutional governments and forget the fragile assemblies that could be dissolved at a monarch's will. From our vantage point, the medieval version looks incomplete, almost naive. But to the people living then, these were not failed products. They were attempts to solve real problems with the tools available. A merchant in 14th century Florence did not see early banking as a doomed prototype of modern finance. He saw a practical method to move value across dangerous distances. A monk using spectacles did not view them as a crude ancestor of laser eye surgery. He saw a way to continue reading sacred texts. A town council installing a mechanical clock was not trying to build global time coordination. It was trying to regulate market hours and civic life more reliably. Medieval innovation was grounded in immediate need. And that is precisely why so many of these products endured. They addressed recurring human concerns: trust in exchange, clarity in communication, fairness in law, coordination in time, safety in shelter, continuity in governance. Even when the execution faltered, the problem remained. And as long as the problem remained, the idea behind the product survived. There is also something else the medieval period demonstrates clearly. Progress is not linear. Technologies can regress. Institutions can collapse. Knowledge can be lost and rediscovered. Political instability can interrupt innovation for generations. The collapse of Roman infrastructure did not permanently eliminate road-building knowledge, but it did delay its large-scale revival. Early gunpowder weapons did not immediately dominate battlefields, but they gradually rendered older fortifications obsolete. History advances unevenly, and the Middle Ages embody that unevenness. It is tempting to divide time into clean eras, ancient, medieval, modern, as though each represents a complete reset. But the reality is more continuous. Medieval Europe inherited fragments of Roman administration, preserved elements of classical philosophy through monastic scholarship, absorbed scientific and mathematical knowledge from the Islamic world, and passed refined systems onward to the Renaissance and beyond. In that chain, very few ideas were absolute failures. Most were bridges, sometimes fragile bridges, sometimes unstable, but bridges nonetheless. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson behind medieval products that seem to fail completely. Innovation does not always announce itself with triumph. Sometimes it looks like a workshop experiment that barely functions. Sometimes it looks like a political compromise that satisfies no one. Sometimes it looks like a financial system that collapses under pressure. But if the underlying concept answers a persistent need, it returns, adjusted, strengthened, scaled. The Middle Ages were not a pause in human ingenuity. They were a proving ground, a period where societies constrained by limited technology and fragmented authority still found ways to experiment with structure in time, in law, in trade, in governance, in architecture, in knowledge itself. And those structures, however imperfect, accumulated. Today, when we unlock our phones to check the time, sign digital contracts, transfer money instantly, travel along mapped highways, read standardized text, vote within representative systems, or rely on documented identity, we are engaging with ideas whose earliest durable forms often emerged in medieval Europe. Not in finished form, not in perfect form, but in recognizable form. The medieval product that failed did not vanish. It matured, slowly, quietly, across centuries, and perhaps that is the most reassuring aspect of history, that even imperfect beginnings can matter, that flawed systems can evolve, that persistence can outlast instability. The Middle Ages teach us that success is not always immediate. Sometimes it is measured in generations. And in that long measurement, many medieval failures were not failures at all. They were foundations. Before we close completely, there is one final angle worth considering: how medieval failures reveal something essential about how civilizations grow. When we look at medieval Europe, we are observing a society rebuilding after fragmentation. The collapse of centralized Roman authority in the West left political division, economic contraction, and regional isolation. For centuries, communities operated locally, often with limited resources and fragile stability. In that environment, innovation could not afford to be reckless. It had to be practical. It had to function within constraint. And that meant most medieval products were incremental rather than revolutionary. Take infrastructure again, not just roads but bridges. Stone bridge construction expanded during the High Middle Ages as trade increased. These projects were expensive, technically demanding, and vulnerable to flood damage. Many bridges collapsed or required constant repair. Funding shortfalls delayed completion. Some towns simply abandoned ambitious designs. But the repeated effort to span rivers permanently reshaped trade routes and regional economies. Even when a bridge failed structurally, knowledge was gained. Builders adjusted arch curvature. Foundations were reinforced. Materials improved. Centuries later, European engineering would produce suspension bridges and steel spans unimaginable to medieval masons. Yet the willingness to attempt durable public infrastructure began in that earlier era. We might also consider the medieval university curriculum. Scholasticism, the dominant intellectual method in many medieval institutions, relied heavily on reconciling authoritative texts through structured debate. To modern observers, this can appear rigid, overly dependent on inherited sources rather than empirical experimentation. And yet, scholastic method trained generations in logical reasoning, structured argument, and disciplined analysis. It did not produce modern science immediately, but it cultivated habits of intellectual rigor that later thinkers would expand into experimental methodology. The medieval classroom may seem distant from modern research laboratories, but the expectation that ideas must be examined systematically, debated publicly, and recorded carefully has deep medieval roots. Even medieval monetary taxation systems, frequently unpopular and inconsistently applied, forced rulers to negotiate with subjects. Kings who required funds often needed consent from representative bodies. That dynamic, though tense, embedded the principle that taxation and representation were connected. It was not democracy in a modern sense, but it created dialogue between authority and governed communities. When we trace constitutional development in Britain and its later influence on political systems in North America and Australia, we can detect those medieval negotiations in the background. The product, the medieval tax levy, often felt like oppression to those paying it. Yet the process of negotiation around taxation shaped political culture profoundly. Across all of these examples, a pattern becomes unmistakable. Medieval products frequently fell short of their ambitions. They were expensive, slow, imprecise, unstable. They faced resistance from tradition and limitation from technology. But they were attempts to measure time more accurately, to preserve knowledge more reliably, to govern more systematically, to trade more securely, to build more durably, to reason more rigorously, and those attempts accumulated, not dramatically, not uniformly, but persistently. If we imagine history as a cathedral under construction, the Middle Ages were not merely laying decorative features. They were shaping the foundation stones. Many of those stones were rough. Some had to be replaced. Others cracked under pressure. But the structure continued rising. And that is perhaps the most important takeaway. When we call a medieval product a complete failure, we are often isolating it from the centuries that followed. We are freezing it in its earliest form. History does not freeze. It flows. The fragile clock becomes the standardized hour. The unstable bank becomes the regulated financial institution. The local assembly becomes the parliament. The parchment archive becomes the digital database. The imperfect bridge becomes the global network. The Middle Ages were not defined by what they lacked compared to modernity. They were defined by what they sustained long enough to evolve. And that endurance, quiet, patient, often overlooked, is why so many medieval products that seem to fail completely are still with us today. Not as relics, but as living systems, refined, expanded, and woven so thoroughly into modern life that we rarely notice their origins. If this journey through medieval innovation has shown anything, it is that failure in history is rarely final. More often, it is the first draft of success. And in that sense, the Middle Ages were not an age of failed products at all. They were an age of unfinished beginnings, beginnings whose consequences still shape the world around us. As we bring this exploration fully to its conclusion, it is worth reflecting not just on medieval products themselves, but on the deeper rhythm of history they reveal. When modern audiences hear the phrase, "failed completely," it suggests finality. It suggests disappearance. It suggests an idea tried, rejected, and forgotten. But the medieval world rarely worked that way. Very few innovations simply vanished without leaving some imprint. Even when institutions collapsed or technologies were outperformed, traces remained, embedded in habits, legal traditions, architectural forms, or intellectual frameworks. The Middle Ages were a period of endurance under limitation. Communication was slow. Travel was dangerous. Political authority was fragmented. Scientific tools were rudimentary. And yet, within those constraints, people continued refining how they lived together. They refined how they measured time. They refined how they recorded debts. They refined how they preserved food. They refined how they built cities. They refined how they stored knowledge. They refined how they governed conflict. In nearly every case, the first versions were incomplete. Mechanical clocks drifted. Banks defaulted. Assemblies fractured. Medical theory misdiagnosed. Roads deteriorated. But each of those systems addressed a recurring human challenge. And because the challenge persisted, so did the attempt to solve it. That is perhaps the defining feature of medieval innovation: persistence rather than perfection. A clock that is inaccurate is still better than none at all. A bank that collapses still proves that credit networks are possible. An assembly that meets irregularly still establishes that rulers can be consulted. These are small shifts in isolation, but over centuries they compound. By the time Europe entered the early modern period, it did not start from nothing. It inherited centuries of administrative practice, mechanical experimentation, legal codification, commercial structure, and educational organization. The Renaissance did not appear in a vacuum. The scientific revolution did not emerge from emptiness. The Industrial Revolution did not invent mechanical thinking from scratch. Each of those transformations rested on groundwork laid during the medieval centuries. And that is why the story of medieval products that seem to fail completely is not really a story about failure. It is a story about incubation. It reminds us that progress often looks unimpressive at first, can look fragile, can look unstable, can even look misguided. But if the core idea answers something fundamental, how to coordinate people, how to reduce uncertainty, how to store information, how to measure reality, it tends to survive long enough to improve. Even today, modern innovations follow the same pattern. Early technologies malfunction. Institutions struggle in their first iterations. Policies require revision. The medieval world shows us that this is not a sign of stagnation. It is a sign of process. When we look back at medieval Europe from the perspective of the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, or Australia, we are not looking at a disconnected past. We are looking at the early architecture of many systems we now consider ordinary: parliamentary governance, contract law, banking networks, universities, standardized language, time discipline, urban planning, public record-keeping. Each of these once existed in imperfect medieval form. Each appeared limited within its own century, and yet each endured. So perhaps the phrase "failed completely" tells us more about how we measure success than about medieval reality. Because in the long arc of history, success is rarely immediate. It is cumulative. It is built from repeated attempts. It is shaped by correction as much as by triumph. The Middle Ages were not an age of finished systems. They were an age of foundations, laid slowly, sometimes unevenly, but laid firmly enough to carry the centuries that followed. And in that sense, medieval products did not fail completely. They simply began quietly, and from those quiet beginnings, the modern world gradually emerged. As we settle into the final reflections of this long journey through medieval Europe, it becomes clear that what we have really been exploring is not a catalog of failed objects, but a different way of understanding historical time. The modern world often prizes speed. We measure innovation in quarters, elections, product cycles, and software updates. Success is expected quickly, and failure is often treated as final. The medieval world operated on a completely different rhythm. A cathedral could take a century to complete. A legal reform might require generations before it stabilized. A commercial practice could emerge in one city, disappear in another, and then quietly reappear decades later in a refined form. In that slower world, failure was rarely decisive. It was simply part of an ongoing adjustment. Consider again the medieval approach to architecture beyond cathedrals and castles. Town halls, guild halls, and marketplaces evolved gradually in design. Early structures were often simple wooden buildings vulnerable to fire and weather. When they burned or decayed, they were rebuilt, sometimes in stone, sometimes with improved layouts. Urban design did not spring from a single visionary blueprint. It evolved through repetition, destruction, and reconstruction. Each rebuilding incorporated lessons from the previous one. Streets were widened slightly. Drainage improved incrementally. Materials changed where budgets allowed. No single medieval town suddenly became a model of modern planning. But across centuries, European urban centers developed recognizable civic cores, squares, administrative buildings, market spaces that structured public life. Modern cities, especially in the United Kingdom and across Europe, still retain medieval street plans and central squares. Even cities in North America and Australia, though built later, adopted planning principles shaped by earlier European models. The medieval product, the wooden guild hall, the modest market square, may not have looked revolutionary, but it shaped how communities gather and organize space. We might also reflect on medieval experimentation in intellectual preservation. Monasteries copied classical texts not because they foresaw the Renaissance, but because preservation aligned with their spiritual and scholarly commitments. Many works survived by chance. Some were lost entirely. From the perspective of the time, this was not a grand civilizational rescue mission. It was routine labor, monks copying manuscripts line by line. Yet those preserved texts would later inform humanist scholarship, scientific inquiry, and political philosophy. The medieval manuscript culture did not know its future significance. It simply sustained continuity, and continuity proved decisive. Even medieval conflict, disruptive as it was, often produced structural refinement. Wars forced rulers to improve taxation systems, coordinate logistics, and formalize chains of command. While conflict brought destruction, it also accelerated administrative learning. Castles redesigned to resist artillery eventually influenced early modern fortifications. Naval improvements driven by warfare later facilitated global trade. None of this suggests that medieval society was harmonious or progressive in a modern sense. It suggests something more subtle. Medieval Europe was adaptive. When systems broke, they were not always abandoned. They were adjusted. When institutions faltered, they were renegotiated. When technologies failed, they were reworked. That adaptive quality is easy to miss because medieval change was not always dramatic. It did not unfold through rapid industrial transformation. It unfolded through patience. And patience is rarely as visible as revolution. Perhaps the most profound insight we gain from examining medieval products that seem to fail completely is this: history is not shaped only by spectacular breakthroughs. It is shaped by survival. The survival of ideas across instability. The survival of institutions across political upheaval. The survival of knowledge across generations. A banking house collapses, but the concept of credit survives. A public clock malfunctions, but the expectation of measured time remains. A representative assembly dissolves, but the memory of consultation persists. A manuscript burns, but others endure. In the long arc of centuries, these survivals accumulate into transformation. The Middle Ages were not defined by perfection. They were defined by perseverance. And when we consider our present world, its complex legal systems, its global financial networks, its universities, its standardized language, its coordinated infrastructure, we are witnessing the matured outcomes of medieval perseverance. The phrase "failed completely" may capture how something looked at a single moment in time. But history rarely judges in single moments. It judges across eras. And across eras, medieval Europe appears not as a graveyard of failed ideas, but as a workshop of unfinished ones. Unfinished yet enduring, unpolished yet foundational. So when we think about the Middle Ages from our modern vantage point, whether in London, New York, Toronto, or Sydney, we might see more than castles and chronicles. We might see the early scaffolding of our own systems, systems that took centuries to refine, systems that began not with certainty, but with experiment. And that may be the quiet power of medieval history. It reminds us that progress does not always announce itself with triumph. Sometimes it begins with something that looks like failure, and patiently becomes the future. As we arrive at the true closing of this long reflection, it may be helpful to shift from individual inventions to something even broader: the medieval relationship with continuity itself. One of the defining features of medieval Europe was not technological speed, but institutional memory. In a world shaped by dynastic change, plague, war, and shifting borders, society still found ways to preserve structure across disruption. That preservation was not always efficient. It was not always peaceful, but it was steady. Take, for example, the medieval church, not in theological terms, but as an administrative network. It maintained records of births, deaths, marriages, and property. It transmitted education across regions. It preserved legal and bureaucratic habits even when secular authority fractured. The church did not function perfectly. It faced corruption, schism, political conflict, and internal reform movements. Yet, as an institution, it demonstrated something vital: that systems could endure beyond individual rulers. That concept, the endurance of institutions beyond personalities, is one of the most important inheritances of the medieval world. Modern states, universities, corporations, and legal systems all depend on the assumption that structures will persist beyond those who temporarily lead them. Medieval Europe normalized that idea, even when its execution was uneven. We might also consider the slow consolidation of customary law. In many regions, law was not invented in a single legislative moment. It developed through precedent, case by case, dispute by dispute. Judges referred to earlier decisions. Traditions were written down gradually. Oral customs became codified over time. This process could appear frustratingly slow. It lacked the clarity of a single, sweeping legal code, but it embedded adaptability within the system. Because law developed through accumulated experience, it could evolve as circumstances changed. Modern common law systems, particularly in the United Kingdom and countries influenced by it, still operate on this principle. The medieval courtroom may have seemed narrow in scope, but it nurtured a method of legal reasoning that remains deeply influential. Even medieval trade fairs reflect this broader continuity. Large commercial fairs, such as those in Champagne, created temporary hubs where merchants from across Europe gathered. These fairs required security, dispute resolution mechanisms, currency exchange, and credit arrangements. Not every fair succeeded, Political instability or conflict could disrupt trade routes. Some fairs declined as economic centers shifted. Yet the model of concentrated commercial exchange under regulated conditions endured. Modern trade expos, financial exchanges, and international business conventions echo those early medieval gatherings. They operate on a larger scale with digital speed and global reach, but the core idea is familiar. The Middle Ages repeatedly demonstrate that when an idea answers a structural need, whether economic, legal, educational, or administrative, it rarely disappears entirely. It adapts. And adaptation, more than perfection, is the engine of historical survival. Perhaps the most important takeaway from all of this is a reframing of what success means in historical terms. Success is not always immediate dominance. It is not always technological superiority. It is not always universal acceptance. Sometimes, success is simply endurance. An idea that can survive criticism, collapse, resistance, and revision is an idea with power. The medieval world was filled with such ideas. Measured time, recorded debt, written contract, representative consultation, institutional education, standardized language, urban regulation, documented identity. None of these reached full maturity between the 5th and 15th centuries. But they did not need to. They only needed to last long enough to be refined. And they did. When modern viewers think of the Middle Ages, it is often through dramatic imagery, armored knights, towering cathedrals, illuminated manuscripts glowing in candlelight. But beneath that imagery lies something quieter and more enduring. A civilization experimenting with structure, sometimes stumbling, sometimes succeeding, always adjusting. The products that seemed to fail completely were often the first drafts of systems that required centuries to stabilize. In that sense, the medieval period teaches patience. Teaches that foundations are rarely glamorous. They are laid stone by stone, often without certainty of what will stand upon them. Yet without those foundations, nothing durable can rise. And so, when we look at the modern world, its legal stability, financial networks, educational institutions, standardized communication, and administrative continuity, we are not looking at a sudden break from the medieval past. We are looking at its long maturation. The Middle Ages were not a detour in history. They were a workshop. And in that workshop, even the products that appeared to fail were quietly shaping the architecture of the future. As we close this documentary journey in full, it may be worth asking one final question. Why do we instinctively underestimate the Middle Ages? Partly because medieval innovation rarely arrived with spectacle. It did not produce factories roaring into life overnight. It did not create global communication in a single leap. It did not standardize science within one generation. Instead, it operated within a world defined by limits. Limited energy sources, limited literacy, limited political unity, limited transportation. And yet, within those limits, something remarkable happened. Europe did not stand still. It reorganized. Slowly, cautiously, imperfectly, but persistently. The medieval centuries were a long negotiation between inheritance and adaptation. Classical knowledge was preserved where possible, reshaped where necessary. External influences from the Islamic world, from Byzantine scholarship, from expanding trade networks, were absorbed and adapted into local frameworks. When a system failed, the response was rarely to abandon structure altogether. It was to modify, Feudal obligations became more contractual. Local courts became more standardized. Market rules became more formalized. Educational communities became more institutionalized. The visible product might falter, but the underlying pursuit of order did not. Take the medieval manor, for example. As an economic unit, it appears rigid by modern standards, bound by obligations, rents, and agricultural cycles. It was not efficient in the industrial sense. It did not foster rapid economic mobility, and yet it provided organizational continuity in a fragmented political landscape. It structured land use, labor obligations, and local dispute resolution. Over time, manorial systems evolved, declined, and were replaced. But the habits of land documentation, rental agreements, and agricultural management persisted. Modern property law and land registries, especially in common law countries, carry faint but traceable echoes of these medieval arrangements. Even the medieval guild system, often criticized for restricting competition, played a stabilizing role in craft transmission. Guilds regulated apprenticeship, ensured quality standards, and provided social support networks. They were not modern corporations. They were not engines of mass production, but they preserved specialized knowledge across generations. When industrialization arrived centuries later, it did not invent skilled labor from nothing. It transformed skills that had been cultivated and organized in guild structures. In that sense, even institutions that appear restrictive in hindsight contributed to continuity. And continuity is the theme that ties all of this together. The medieval world was not defined by dramatic leaps forward. It was defined by the refusal to collapse into disorder. When plague reduced populations, administrative systems adjusted. When wars redrew borders, legal customs adapted. When trade routes shifted, financial instruments evolved. This resilience is easy to overlook because it does not produce a single defining invention. But it produces something arguably more important: durability. When modern societies in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, or Australia rely on parliamentary debate, written contracts, centralized archives, regulated markets, public universities, documented identity, and synchronized timekeeping, they are engaging with systems shaped over centuries. Many of those systems passed through medieval refinement, not perfected, but stabilized enough to endure. And perhaps that is the true answer to the idea of medieval products that failed completely. They did not need to succeed in their first form. They needed to survive. The heavy plow that struggled in rocky soil still informed agricultural adaptation. The early bank that collapsed still proved that credit networks were viable. The fragile manuscript still carried knowledge forward. The inaccurate clock still disciplined communal time. The limited assembly still introduced consultation. Failure in the medieval context was rarely final. It was formative. It shaped the next attempt, and the next, and the next, until, across centuries, what began as experiment became expectation. The Middle Ages remind us that history is not built only by visionaries or revolutions. It is built by persistence, by generations willing to refine what they inherited, by communities willing to repair what breaks rather than discard it entirely. And in that long persistence, the medieval world quietly constructed the scaffolding of modern civilization. So when we speak of medieval products that failed completely, we might pause, because very few truly did. Most were simply unfinished. And from those unfinished beginnings, the modern world slowly took shape. As we settle into the final meditation on this subject, it becomes clear that the real story of medieval products is not about objects at all. It is about time, about how long it takes for human systems to mature. We live in an age that expects immediate refinement. A new device is released, updated, optimized, and replaced within a handful of years. Policies are judged within election cycles. Technologies are declared revolutionary almost as soon as they appear. The medieval world knew nothing of that tempo. A reform introduced in the 12th century might not bear visible fruit until the 15th. A legal custom might require generations before it became stable precedent. An architectural innovation might demand repeated reconstruction before achieving reliability. Measured against modern speed, that can look like stagnation. But measured against historical endurance, it looks like foundation building. Consider how medieval communities handled disaster. Fires destroyed cities. Plagues devastated populations. Harvest failures brought famine. Political upheavals redrew borders. And yet, after each rupture, rebuilding occurred within recognizable frameworks. Markets reopened, courts reconvened, churches were reconstructed, records were recopied. Systems, though fragile, were not erased. That continuity mattered more than perfection, because perfection is rare in history. What sustains societies is not flawless design, but resilience under strain. Even medieval monetary collapse, so common in certain regions, did not abolish trade. It forced adaptation. When silver supplies dwindled, alternative arrangements developed. When coins were debased, merchants adjusted exchange rates. When banking houses failed, others rose in their place. Each crisis revealed weakness, but it also revealed necessity. Commerce did not disappear simply because its instruments faltered. The need for exchange ensured its return in revised form. The same was true of governance. When assemblies were dissolved, grievances did not vanish. They resurfaced later, often stronger. When rulers overextended authority, negotiation eventually returned as a practical necessity. The medieval period was full of tension between power and consultation, between centralization and local autonomy. Those tensions were not resolved neatly, but they were never forgotten, and the memory of negotiation became embedded in political culture. Modern parliamentary systems, especially those rooted in British tradition and later extended to North America and Australia, reflect centuries of incremental negotiation that can be traced back through medieval practice. It is easy to focus on what medieval Europe lacked: industrial productivity, advanced medicine, global connectivity. But it is equally important to recognize what it preserved. Preserved institutional habit. It preserved documentary culture, preserved legal reasoning. It preserved mechanical curiosity. It preserved agricultural sustainability. And preservation is not passive. It requires deliberate effort. The monk copying a manuscript by hand was not inventing a new philosophy, but he was ensuring that philosophy would survive. The town council regulating market weights was not designing a global trade regime, but it was embedding fairness into local exchange. The artisan refining a gear mechanism was not anticipating industrial automation, but he was expanding mechanical imagination. The medieval product that appeared to fail often failed only in scale or precision. Rarely did it fail in principle. And principle is what history carries forward. When we step back across the centuries, what becomes visible is not a dark age of abandoned experiments. It is a long apprenticeship in systems thinking, an apprenticeship in how to structure authority, manage risk, preserve knowledge, and coordinate human effort. The results were uneven. They were incomplete, but they were cumulative, and cumulative change is powerful. Today's world, with its bureaucratic states, regulated economies, global universities, standardized language, and synchronized infrastructure, is not simply modern. It is layered with centuries of adjustment. And many of those layers were laid in medieval Europe. So perhaps the phrase failed completely is best understood as a snapshot taken too early. Because when history is allowed to run its full course, very few ideas that answer enduring human needs remain failures. They evolve, they return, they mature. The Middle Ages remind us that progress is not always visible in the moment. Sometimes it is hidden in repetition, in rebuilding, in revising, in preserving, and in that quiet, patient work, foundations are formed. Foundations strong enough to support worlds the medieval mind could scarcely imagine. Yet worlds built, in no small part, upon its unfinished beginnings. And perhaps, as a final reflection, it is worth considering what the medieval experience tells us about our own time. When we study medieval products that appeared to fail completely, we are not simply examining distant curiosities. We are observing a pattern that still governs how societies evolve. The Middle Ages teach us that innovation is rarely clean. It is rarely efficient. It is often controversial, unevenly adopted, and misunderstood in its earliest form. When mechanical clocks first appeared, many people likely saw them as unreliable novelties. When early banking networks collapsed, critics may have concluded that large-scale credit systems were inherently unstable. When representative assemblies struggled for influence, they may have seemed politically fragile or even unnecessary. Yet the needs those products addressed did not disappear. The need to coordinate time, the need to move money securely, the need to consult governed communities. As long as those needs persisted, experimentation continued. That is one of the most important lessons medieval Europe offers. Failure does not end a useful idea, tests it, and if the idea survives testing, if it adapts rather than vanishes, it grows stronger. The medieval world endured famine, plague, dynastic collapse, economic contraction, and technological limitation. Yet across those disruptions, its systems did not dissolve entirely. They bent, they adjusted, they reappeared. Even when populations fell dramatically during the Black Death, institutional memory remained. Land tenure systems adapted to labor shortages. Wage regulations were attempted. Urban authorities revised policies in response to new social realities. The responses were imperfect. They often generated conflict, but they demonstrate a society learning under pressure. Learning slowly, learning unevenly, but learning nonetheless. And that slow learning accumulated. It accumulated in archives, in court precedents, in market customs, in educational traditions, in architectural forms, in financial instruments. Each generation inherited structures that were not finished, but functional enough to refine. By the time Europe entered the early modern era, It possessed a dense web of institutions capable of supporting expansion, exploration, and scientific inquiry. Those institutions did not emerge suddenly in the 16th or 17th centuries. They had been forming for centuries, quietly, often clumsily, sometimes disastrously, but persistently, and perhaps that is the truest measure of medieval innovation. Not brilliance in isolation, but endurance across instability. The products that seemed to fail completely were often judged by immediate performance. They cracked under pressure. They under-delivered. They faltered. But the ideas behind them were not extinguished. They were revised, strengthened, reapplied. Today, when we navigate digital banking systems, rely on documented contracts, attend universities, vote within representative governments, consult standardized calendars, or inhabit regulated cities, we are participating in structures that medieval Europe helped normalize. The medieval clock was inaccurate, but it normalized scheduled time. The early bank was unstable, but it normalized credit exchange. The local assembly was limited, but it normalized consultation. The manuscript was rare, but it normalized preserved knowledge. These normalizations matter, because once a concept becomes normal, even if imperfect, it becomes part of expectation. And expectations shape the future. The Middle Ages were not a blank space between ancient achievement and modern brilliance. They were a laboratory of continuity, a period where societies, constrained by technology and fragmented politics, still experimented with how to organize human life more reliably. And though many of those experiments seemed to fail completely in their earliest form, they left behind something more valuable than perfection. They left behind precedent. Precedent that future generations could improve. Precedent that allowed systems to scale. Precedent that transformed fragility into durability over time. In the end, the story of medieval products that failed completely is not a story of disappointment. It is a story of patience, a reminder that history rewards persistence more than immediacy, and that the world we inhabit, structured, regulated, interconnected, is not the result of sudden invention alone. It is the result of centuries of refinement, much of it medieval, much of it imperfect, all of it foundational, and perhaps that is the quietest and most enduring legacy the Middle Ages left behind. As we reach the final stretch of this long reflection, it becomes clear that the true significance of medieval failures lies not in what they lacked, but in what they preserved long enough to evolve. History is often narrated through dramatic turning points. The fall of Rome, the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, the industrial age. These moments appear bold and decisive, as if entire worlds shifted overnight. But between those turning points lie centuries of quieter labor. The Middle Ages were filled with that labor. When Roman administrative systems fragmented in Western Europe, governance did not disappear. It localized. Land records were simplified, then gradually formalized again. Oaths of loyalty replaced imperial bureaucracy, and then over generations those oaths were written down, archived, and transformed into legal instruments. This did not look like progress at first. It looked like improvisation, but improvisation sustained continuity. Even medieval coinage, so frequently unstable, reveals this pattern. Kings and princes minted coins to assert authority, sometimes diluting silver content to stretch resources. Markets responded with distrust. Exchange rates fluctuated, yet trade continued. Merchants weighed metal. They adjusted values. They innovated credit systems to reduce reliance on coin altogether. In other words, weakness in one instrument encouraged refinement in another. The fragility of coinage strengthened the use of bills of exchange. The instability of transport strengthened trust-based merchant networks. The inefficiency of local courts strengthened written contracts. Failure in one dimension often accelerated development in another. That is not stagnation. It is adaptive evolution. The same can be said of medieval military architecture. Early stone castles represented significant advances over wooden fortifications. But once gunpowder artillery entered European battlefields, high walls became vulnerable. Some fortresses that had stood for centuries fell more quickly than expected. To contemporaries, that must have felt like technological collapse. Yet rather than abandoning fortification entirely, military engineers redesigned defensive systems. Lower walls, angled bastions, thicker ramparts. The medieval castle did not survive unchanged, but its transformation laid the groundwork for early modern military engineering. Obsolescence triggered innovation. We see this again in intellectual life. Medieval scholasticism has often been caricatured as rigid and overly dependent on authority. It relied heavily on reconciling classical texts through logical argument rather than experimentation. Yet within that structure, habits of disciplined reasoning developed. Universities formalized disputation as a method of inquiry. Arguments were structured, counterarguments anticipated, evidence examined within accepted frameworks. It was not modern science, but it was organized thought. When later thinkers began to emphasize observation and experimentation, they did so within institutions already accustomed to structured debate. The medieval classroom did not produce the scientific revolution directly, but it cultivated intellectual continuity that made later transformation possible. Even in agriculture, what seems modest by modern standards proved foundational. The heavy plow, horse collar, watermill, and crop rotation systems did not eliminate hardship. Harvest failures remained common. Famine was never entirely banished, but productivity improved gradually. Surpluses supported urban growth. Urban growth supported specialization. Specialization supported trade. Trade supported financial innovation. In that chain, no single invention appears decisive, but together they form an ecosystem of incremental change. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. The medieval world reminds us that civilizations are not built by isolated breakthroughs alone. They are built by systems that survive stress. Systems that can bend without breaking entirely. Systems that preserve core functions long enough for refinement. A medieval clock might lose minutes each day, but it introduced a cultural expectation that time could be segmented and measured mechanically. A medieval bank might collapse under sovereign debt, but it demonstrated that credit could extend commerce beyond physical coin. A medieval parliament might be summoned irregularly, but it established the precedent that rulers could be consulted. A medieval manuscript might be rare and error-prone, but it kept knowledge alive through uncertain centuries. When we describe these as failures, we are measuring them against outcomes centuries away. But in their own context, they were bridges across instability. And bridges matter, because without bridges, nothing connects. The Middle Ages connected antiquity to modernity, not with spectacle, but with persistence. When we look at the modern world, from financial systems in New York and London, to parliamentary debate in Westminster and Ottawa, to universities across North America and Australia, we are seeing systems layered across centuries. Layered with medieval precedent, layered with medieval habit, layered with medieval trial and correction. The products that seemed to fail completely did not disappear into obscurity. They matured beyond recognition, and that maturation required time measured not in years, but in generations. So perhaps the most accurate way to understand medieval innovation is not as failure or success, but as continuity under constraint. A society working with limited tools, limited speed, limited reach, yet still constructing frameworks strong enough to endure. In that endurance lies the real legacy of the Middle Ages. Not dramatic invention, but durable foundation. And from those foundations, the modern world slowly rose. If we allow ourselves one last layer of reflection, we begin to see that the medieval story is not only about the survival of specific tools or institutions. It is about the survival of habits of organizing life in structured ways. Habits are less visible than inventions. They do not gleam like steel or tower like stone, but they shape civilization just as profoundly. The Middle Ages cultivated habits of record-keeping. Even when parchment was scarce and ink expensive, agreements were written down. Property was described. Obligations were recorded. Archives were guarded imperfectly but deliberately. This habit changed expectations. A promise was no longer merely spoken. It could be documented. A boundary was no longer merely remembered. It could be mapped and preserved. Authority became something that could be referenced, not just asserted. Modern bureaucratic states depend on this assumption that records exist, that documents matter, that evidence can be retrieved. That assumption solidified across medieval centuries. The same can be said of habits of scheduled life. Before mechanical clocks, time was fluid. It followed daylight and seasonal rhythm. With the gradual spread of clock towers and later domestic clocks, communal life became more segmented. Markets opened at certain hours. Courts convened at designated times. Prayer followed regulated intervals. Even if the clocks were imprecise, the expectation of punctuality began to take root. In today's world, punctuality is embedded in nearly every system, from transportation timetables to financial markets synchronized across continents. That discipline did not emerge suddenly in the 18th or 19th centuries. Its cultural roots reach back to medieval towers striking the hour. We can also observe the medieval cultivation of habits of negotiation. Feudal obligations were not purely unilateral. They involved reciprocal expectations, protection in exchange for service, land in exchange for loyalty. While power imbalances were undeniable, the structure was not entirely arbitrary. When conflicts arose, they were often mediated through assemblies, councils, or courts. Over time, these practices normalized the idea that disputes could be settled within frameworks rather than through constant violence alone. Modern contract law and dispute resolution mechanisms build upon this deepening expectation that structure can replace chaos. Even medieval religious life, often portrayed solely in spiritual terms, contributed to administrative continuity. Parish systems organized communities geographically. Tithes were collected systematically. Clergy were educated within structured hierarchies. Communication moved through diocesan networks. While theology shaped belief, organization shaped durability. Institutional layering, local, regional, continental, became a familiar pattern. Modern multinational institutions, whether governmental or corporate, echo that layered approach. And perhaps most importantly, the Middle Ages cultivated a habit of preservation. Despite wars, plagues, and political fragmentation, manuscripts were recopied. Laws were codified. Buildings were repaired. Knowledge was transmitted from master to apprentice. Preservation is rarely dramatic. It is quiet, repetitive, and often uncelebrated, but it allows continuity, and continuity allows growth. When we reconsider medieval products that seem to fail completely, we might reframe them not as failed endpoints, but as early expressions of these habits. The early bank expressed the habit of structured exchange. The early clock expressed the habit of measured coordination. The early parliament expressed the habit of consultative governance. The early university expressed the habit of institutionalized learning. The early archive expressed the habit of documentary authority. Each was imperfect. Each struggled within its own century, yet each reinforced a behavioral pattern that endured. And habits, once normalized, are remarkably resilient. The modern world rests not only on inventions, but on inherited expectations. That time should be synchronized. That agreements should be enforceable. That knowledge should be preserved. That authority should be recorded. That commerce should follow rules. These expectations feel natural to us, but they were cultivated gradually. The Middle Ages did not perfect them. They normalized them, and normalization is powerful, because once something becomes normal, it becomes difficult to imagine society without it. The medieval world may appear distant, lit by candles, defended by stone walls, governed by dynastic lines. Yet beneath that imagery lies a civilization patiently refining structure, often under hardship, often without certainty of outcome, but persistently, and that persistence matters. When we look at modern systems, complex, interdependent, global, we are witnessing the compounded effect of centuries of refinement. The medieval period was not a detour in that process. It was a crucial phase of stabilization, a time when ideas that had flickered in antiquity were kept alive, a time when new structures were tested slowly, a time when imperfection did not prevent continuation. So if we ask again whether medieval products failed completely, the answer becomes clearer. Some failed in their original form. Some collapsed under pressure. Some were replaced by better designs. But very few failed in principle. And principle is what survives across time. The Middle Ages remind us that history is not built solely by brilliance. It is built by endurance, by repetition, by repair, by refinement, and from that long endurance, the architecture of the modern world quietly emerged. As we reach the final, quiet horizon of this discussion, it may help to imagine the medieval world not as a gallery of failed inventions, but as a workshop that never closed. In that workshop, tools were rough. Materials were limited. Communication between regions was slow. Political stability could not be taken for granted. And yet, work continued. That persistence is the defining thread running through every example we've explored. The medieval banking house that collapsed under royal debt did not discredit the idea of finance. It exposed its vulnerabilities. Later bankers adjusted risk, diversified loans, and formalized accounting. Instability became instruction. The early mechanical clock that drifted off time did not eliminate the desire for measurement. It sharpened it. Craftsmen refined escapements. Metalwork improved. Precision became a goal rather than an assumption. The representative assembly that struggled for influence did not end consultation. It established precedent. Later generations would invoke that precedent during political crises, building upon it rather than inventing governance from nothing. The manuscript that contained copying errors did not invalidate written culture. It emphasized the need for consistency. Printing technology later expanded what medieval scribes had preserved. Failure in medieval Europe often functioned as feedback, and feedback is essential to development. What makes the Middle Ages so important in the broader sweep of history is not that they produced polished systems. It is that they produced resilient ones. Resilience is different from brilliance. Brilliance dazzles. Resilience endures. A medieval town might burn and be rebuilt along similar lines. A trade network might collapse during war and resume when peace returned. A legal reform might falter and later be reinstated in modified form. The ability to rebuild within recognizable frameworks meant that knowledge was not erased with each crisis. Even the Black Death, one of the most devastating pandemics in European history, did not dismantle institutional life permanently. Universities reopened, courts reconvened, markets revived. Labor systems shifted in response to demographic change. The structures bent. They did not disappear. And bending without vanishing is the hallmark of a durable civilization. Modern societies often assume that progress is defined by acceleration, faster production, faster communication, faster decision-making. The medieval world shows another model. Progress through accumulation, through habit formation, through repeated correction, through institutional memory. A heavy plow improved soil cultivation in one region. That surplus supported towns. Towns supported trade. Trade supported banking. Banking required accounting. Accounting strengthened literacy. Literacy reinforced universities. Each step alone appears modest. Together they form a web. And webs are strong precisely because they distribute weight across many strands. The Middle Ages wove strands, not always evenly, not always successfully, but persistently. When we look at the modern landscape, whether in London's financial district, Washington's legislative chambers, Toronto's universities, or Sydney's courts, we see structures layered with centuries of refinement. Medieval Europe did not invent all of these from scratch, but it normalized them. It stabilized them long enough for expansion. And that is why so many medieval products that seem to fail completely remain embedded in daily life. They were not final forms. They were formative stages. We often admire the Renaissance for rediscovering classical knowledge, the Enlightenment for advancing political philosophy, and the Industrial Revolution for mechanizing production. But none of those transformations would have occurred in an institutional vacuum. They required a foundation of literacy, law, finance, administration, and mechanical curiosity already in place. Much of that foundation was medieval, and foundations rarely receive the same celebration as the towers they support. Yet without them, nothing stands. Perhaps that is the quiet humility of medieval history. It does not overwhelm with spectacle. It sustains, preserves, it adjusts, prepares. When we ask whether medieval products failed completely, we are often asking the wrong question. The better question might be, did they last long enough to be improved? And in most cases, the answer is yes. They lasted through famine, through plague, through war, through political upheaval. They lasted long enough to be inherited. An inheritance is powerful, because every generation builds not from nothing, but from what remains. The Middle Ages left behind systems imperfect yet functional, flawed yet resilient. And from those systems the modern world emerged, not suddenly but gradually, not flawlessly but firmly. So the story of medieval products that failed completely is, in the end, a story about endurance, about ideas that refused to vanish, about structures that survived long enough to evolve, and about a civilization that, despite limitation, quietly laid the groundwork for centuries yet to come. That quiet groundwork is still beneath us. We rarely notice it, but it holds. And if we allow ourselves one final, steady look across the centuries, we begin to understand that the medieval period offers something deeper than a collection of early prototypes. It offers a lesson in historical patience. In the Middle Ages, innovation did not move with urgency. It moved with necessity. When fields failed to produce enough grain, agricultural tools were refined. When trade routes became dangerous, financial instruments were adjusted. When disputes escalated, legal customs were clarified. When cities grew crowded, regulations slowly accumulated. No single reform solved everything, but each attempt added a layer. Over time, those layers thickened into systems. That layering is the quiet architecture of civilization. Take the example of maritime insurance again. Early policies in Italian trading cities were simple agreements between merchants and investors. They lacked the regulatory oversight and mathematical precision of modern actuarial science. Disputes were common. Enforcement depended heavily on reputation and local courts. By modern standards, these arrangements were fragile. Yet they introduced a transformative idea. Risk could be shared and quantified rather than simply endured. That idea did not require perfection in its first century. It required survival. Centuries later, global insurance markets would rest upon the same principle. Refined, regulated, scaled, but recognizable in origin. Or consider the evolution of standardized measures. Medieval markets were notorious for inconsistency. A pound of grain in one town might differ from a pound in another. Authorities struggled to enforce uniform standards. At times, regulation failed entirely, but the frustration produced demand for consistency. Gradually, monarchs and city governments enforced standard weights. Inspection systems improved. Written guidelines circulated. The medieval system was messy, yet it laid the groundwork for the precise measurement standards that modern economies depend upon. And this pattern repeats again and again. The medieval postal relay system, though slow and exclusive, normalized the idea that communication could be structured and routinized. The medieval parish system, though uneven in coverage, normalized geographic administrative units tied to record-keeping. The medieval university, though narrow in curriculum, normalized institutional learning beyond personal apprenticeship. The medieval guild, though restrictive, normalized quality control and skill transmission. Each system appears limited. Each system faced collapse or reform, but each system endured long enough to influence what followed. And endurance is the critical word. The Middle Ages were an era of endurance, an era in which societies could not afford to discard every flawed experiment. They repaired what they could. They modified what failed. They absorbed external knowledge where possible, mathematics from the Islamic world, classical texts preserved through monastic copying, technological exchange through trade. Progress did not announce itself dramatically. It accumulated quietly. If we imagine civilization as a vast manuscript, the medieval centuries were not blank pages between chapters. They were densely written margins, annotations, corrections, clarifications, sometimes messy, sometimes overwritten, but always contributing. When modern observers describe medieval products as having failed completely, they often isolate those products from the centuries that followed. They see the crude clock, but not the culture of punctuality it fostered. They see the bankrupt bank, but not the normalized credit it introduced. They see the unstable parliament, but not the precedent of consultation it embedded. They see the imperfect medical theory, but not the institutional framework of hospitals and training it helped solidify. History is rarely about the first version of anything. It is about what survives long enough to be revised. The Middle Ages specialized in survival. Survival of texts, survival of institutions, survival of habits, survival of structure in a fragmented world. And from that survival, refinement became possible. By the time early modern Europe expanded outward, through exploration, scientific inquiry, and global trade, it did so supported by systems that had been tested, stressed, and adjusted across medieval centuries. Not perfected, but proven durable. So perhaps the phrase "failed completely" should be retired when speaking of medieval products, because complete failure leaves no trace. And medieval Europe left traces everywhere. In law, in finance, in education, in governance, in measurement, in urban life, in communication, in time itself. The medieval world was not the end of something grand, nor merely the waiting room for something better. It was the slow forging of continuity, and continuity, though less dramatic than revolution, is what allows revolutions to succeed. When we look around the modern world, its bureaucracies, universities, courts, parliaments, markets, and cities, we are standing atop layers of accumulated adjustment. Many of those layers were laid in candlelight. Many were written in ink on parchment. Many were debated in drafty halls or negotiated in crowded marketplaces. They were imperfect. They were sometimes unstable, but they endured. And in that endurance, the future was prepared. The Middle Ages remind us that history's foundations are rarely flawless, but they are strong enough. And sometimes, strong enough is all that is required to carry centuries forward.